Bitterly he wept for his friend. He wandered over the wilderness as a hunter. He roamed over the plains. In his bitterness he cried, "How can I rest? How can I be at peace? Despair is in my heart. What my brother is now, that shall I be when I am dead. I am afraid of death." So at length Gilgamesh came to great mountains, about which he had heard many things.
And we're here with Jim Lucino. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
How did you get into writing Star Wars tie-ins?
That is directly related to Robotech, because when Del Rey Books decided they wanted to do a long 20-book series, the editors there knew of my background in Robotech, and they first hired me sort of as a consultant to come over and supervise sort of the construction and the detailing of this new series. And at the time, I thought that my involvement was going to be limited to that, but I'm still mucking about in Star Wars land.
Do you credit the influence of Brian Daley with helping lead you to this point?
Well, I will always consider Brian as one of my mentors, in terms of writing in general and certainly in science fiction. And we traveled a lot together in different parts of the world, and I was with him when he was, plotting all of the original Han Solo novels, and we'd toss ideas back and forth. So he's sort of, maybe he's sitting on my shoulder or sitting on somebody's shoulder and whispering in someone's ear to use me in Star Wars. But however it happened, I'll always give Brian credit.
James Lucino, my best friend, another Del Rey author and a mainstream novelist, he and I got together, and under the name Jack McKinney, we wrote the Robotech series.
No.
And the Sentinels. And
really?
Yes, that's
I've
us.
seen those things in the stores.
For your listeners who may not know, Robotech is about an 85-episode animated TV series, and it was very popular, and we were hired on to adapt Robotech as 12 books, which we did, and we tried to write them for older readers.
Really?
And, yeah, I think we succeeded, at least according to the mail we did. A giant spaceship crashes on Earth in 1999 in the middle of a global civil war, which is still depressingly a likely scenario, but the technological secrets in there give the human race a reason and a way to stop fighting among itself. But unfortunately, the owners of the starship show up to try and reclaim it, and that's the beginning of an interstellar war that goes on for several generations.
Was it a very different experience between writing the two worlds?
Very different experiences. With Robotech, we were sort of beginning this franchise. There weren't the rules and regulations that have come into play in franchises like Star Wars and Star Trek, where you were overseen by a group of people who make decisions regarding this big picture that I'm talking about. With Robotech, Brian and I didn't have any of that. I mean, we were writing these adaptations, and as long as Carl Macek and the people at Harmony Gold were okay with it, we had as much liberty as any writer could hope for. With Star Wars, you've got to jump through a lot of hoops. You've got to submit outlines beforehand. Those outlines have to be approved by several people. There's a lot of back and forth discussion that goes on. There's a lot of tweaking that goes on. And there's a lot of things that you have to adhere to that you don't find in some of the smaller franchises.
Can you talk about what it was like for you way back when you first saw Star Wars?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of build-up. I mean, no one knew much about it, and it seemed like it was going to be kind of King Arthur in outer space. And Brian and I didn't know what to expect, but we started to hear good word of mouth, and we weren't expecting very much. I remember we went to some strip mall on Route 4 in New Jersey and just, got blasted beforehand on tequila or something, and went into the theater and just had our minds blown. I mean, the opening segment, we just looked at each other and just, I remember Brian coming out of the theater and thinking, science fiction will never be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And
it wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, it was like life altering for us.
nothing was the same, ever since. I mean, especially for Brian, it was on screen was the realization of everything he had ever wanted to see in science fiction, and it really, really had a great impact on him.
And it must have been shortly after that that he was approached about writing the Star Wars novels, wasn't it?
I think it may have been a year later that he was approached by Judy Lynn Del Rey to take a stab at writing a trilogy of novels based around one of the characters. I think Luke was not in the mix, but he could have written about Lando, Han, possibly even Leia. But he chose Han, who appealed to him in the films because he felt that Han was the only character in A New Hope who actually made a moral choice. And Brian saw Han as kind of a modern counterpart of the kind of characters that Humphrey Bogart played in Casablanca and other films. So he was immediately attracted to sort of that notion of a rogue with a heart of gold who's always making the right decisions for the wrong reasons.
The reason I picked Han Solo was because he's the only one who really makes a moral decision in the course of the movie that changes him. Everyone else starts out bad and ends up bad, or starts out good and ends up good. He's the one who turns around in the middle of his departure and comes back. So I thought that it would be fun to play around with a character like that. And so what I was thinking was that these would be some of the adventures that would be going through his mind during that 20 minutes when he was gone. And obviously he's been flying along with his buddy Chewbacca, the Wookiee, the big hairy guy. And Chewbacca's got more of a moral conscience than he does, I think, and is probably jazzing him, going, you know you're not going to be happy leaving him behind.
Right.
Think about this that happened to us, and think about the time that happened to us, and all these things that you've said and done, and you're just a phony. You're not going to abandon these people. You couldn't live with yourself. So these are some of the things that happened to him earlier on. I see him as a really as an idealist who's been disillusioned and perhaps betrayed. And
he's become cynical.
Yes, and he's taken on this armor of cynicism, as you say. He's become solipsistic in a way, but he does the right things for the wrong reasons in the books. Ostensibly, he's just looking after number one, but it always works out to something that helps the good guys. It's sort of like Rick Blaine in Casablanca. Yes, I was a gun runner, but I made money. I was paid well every time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, you were, but that's not why you really did it.
I was always liked Han Solo. I thought he was definitely, as you say, the most interesting character because he had sort of a shady side to himself. He was not, as you say, all good or all evil. He was not a comic book character, I guess, as some of the others could be described as.
Very much a contemporary character because it's not easy for people to let their ideals show. They're just asking for, to take some sort of a shot. And in the case of Chewbacca and Han, there's always the reference to things like Terry and the Pirates. And he's high-flying, hard-fighting guys. But in the case of these two, I think there's also a tradition that comes from Bing Crosby and Bob Hope from the Road Pictures. Just a couple of guys who have to use humor to get by. A lot of the time, they have to make these wry wisecracks to each other, or they just couldn't get past it.
Given his enjoyment of the movie, was he excited to be given the chance to write in the Star Wars universe?
Oh, it was it was cloud nine. I mean, it was more than he could have hoped for. He was writing his own novels and doing very well. His books were among the first printed by Del Rey when it became an imprint of Ballantine, along with Terry Brooks. And the two of them quickly became very, very popular in the science fiction community. But when he had a chance to write for Star Wars, he just jumped at it, both to hone his craft and also because he was so floored by the vision that George Lucas had put forth.
So he picked the Han Solo character. Did he ever, since you two were writing partners and everything, bounce any ideas for stories off of you, or did he pretty much know what he wanted to do with the characters?
Oh, no, we talked all the time. I mean, while he was working on that trilogy, I was kind of his sounding board for a lot of the ideas. I mean, I sort of watched those three novels take shape. He wrote each of them very quickly. I don't think he spent more than maybe 5 weeks on any one of them. He was under a tight deadline to do it, but he just was so enthusiastic about it that the ideas just poured out from him. Some of the ideas were things that had been germinating in his head for a long time and probably would have found their way into some of his own novels. And he just gobbled up information, especially information about technology. And in Han Solo's Revenge, I think it's most apparent that he really did a lot of research and really had a lot of understanding about technology and everything from surfing to the nuts and bolts of repairing a car. And he loved to kind of work that stuff into the novels. And with Chewbacca and Han, he had perfect characters for that sort of thing.
Lucia was a librarian in the Anne Arundel County Library System and had access to materials at the Smithsonian, right? Library of Congress. But the rule of thumb is, when you've got all this research and you've finally done it all, the rule of thumb is use about a quarter of it. Don't put it all in there. It's the first mark of a tyro is to really load it down with all the research that they've done to show what they've done. So when you do have all that research done, take it easy.
I think the fact that he was given his own little corner, or could create his own corner of the Star Wars galaxy, was the perfect situation for Brian, because he could then fill that base up with plots of his own design and just use the Star Wars universe as the backdrop. And he did that, beautifully. I mean, he really, in a lot of ways, came up with a lot of the vocabulary of the early Star Wars expanded universe novels.
What is your favorite Star Wars movie?
Empire Strikes Back. I mean, it's my favorite movie because it skewed a little darker. It had great dialogue. It had so many wonderful scenes, so many cool revelations. Only thing that lessens it for me is my close friend Brian Daley, who was working on Han Solo novels back then.
Oh yeah.
Knew early on that Vader was Luke's father, and felt compelled to tell me before.
Oh no! Oh no!
Right, ruined that little surprise.
Oh my!
But yeah, I think that would be my favorite anyway.
The ultimate spoiler. That's good.
You were present at some of the recording sessions for the radio drama. Were there any interesting stories or anything that happened there?
The thing I remember most, I was present at a number of them that were recorded in New York City with, I remember Mark Hamill and some of the other character actors who went on to do great things, like David Alan Grier, who went on to In Living Color, was there doing the voice of, I can't remember whether it was Pilot or Stormtrooper, and of course Anthony Daniels was there. But what I really remember about those sessions was Brian sitting over in a corner of the sound room writing what are called wild lines, where, you have to have, in these action scenes, you sort of have to have, people talking in the background. And Brian would just be scribbling furiously and passing all these notes to the various voice actors who would do the wild lines. And sometimes parts of the script wouldn't work out, and Brian was constantly changing things right up to the moment of recording, and he was terrific at that. If you asked Brian to give you an alternative way of saying something, he'd give you 10 ways. So that's mostly what I remember, and a lot of enthusiasm with Mark Hamill and everyone else who took part in those early recordings.
He did the radio dramas for Star Wars and Empire in the 80s, and then later in the 80s, when they were looking at renewing the books, he and you pitched ideas.
Early on, before the licensing agreement went to Bantam Books, and Brian had been asked to think about starting off a whole series of novels, Star Wars novels, and had pitched that to Del Rey and Lucasfilm.
What happened was there was a woman named Risa Kessler at Ballantine who was in charge of licensing rights. And she and others at Ballantine Books were not sure that there was a future in Star Wars, and they were really waffling about renewing the license. But they decided they were going to give it one more chance. And they contacted Brian, and they contacted me, and we were going to do the first of these spin-off novels. And Brian was going to write a series about the search for and the training of new Jedi. It would have been a very, very different direction than Tim went. And I was actually writing a book for them called The Tao of the Force, which was going to be a sort of a non-fiction exploration of the Force that was based on, it was going to be sort of excerpts taken from old Jedi texts that would provide lessons for the Jedi. And we came this close to getting those books out there. And in the end, Del Rey decided to surrender the license. Bantam picked it up, and Tim and the rest ran with it.
Brian and I did a lot of traveling together to remote areas of the world, and we had just finished a hike in Nepal, a long hike, about 4 or 5 weeks on foot, and we came out of the mountains, and there was a telegram waiting for him at the hotel that we were staying at, and it was from Lucia St. Clair, who's his partner, and Lucia wrote that they were interested in doing the radio drama. It seemed like a done deal that they were going to do Return of the Jedi. This is back in, I guess, 1982 or 83 maybe. And Brian was all set. I mean, right away, as soon as that telegram came, he sat down and started working out how he was going to attack that series. But then the funding fell apart, and the project was shelved.
Now, Jim, one of the things that I really found interesting about the life that you led is that you're a world traveler, that you spent a lot of time in your life traveling to different parts of the world. Was that something you wanted to do since you were a kid? Did something happen in your life where you're like, I have to get out there and see the world? And what were some of the more interesting places that you've been to?
I think I've always been in love with travel. My father was a career Marine, and he was stationed at various places around the world. So just growing up, I used to get some all sorts of postcards from him from all sorts of exotic places. So I was always interested in travel. And then, but my real love for travel actually came out of a music background. I was in a lot of rock and roll bands and was on the road quite a bit, and realized that I liked traveling, but I didn't like traveling with bands. That I was interested in seeing the world, but not like that, not at night, and not in the haze that I was often in. So, I just sort of set out on my own and spent about 10 years traveling in Africa, and Asia, South America, through my 20s. I was traveling, and it was really helpful in developing my love of writing, because I kept journals while I traveled, and from those journals came a first novel, and that got me into writing.
Do you think that it kind of goes without saying, but your travels and your experience with this, it must have been influencing your work all the time then.
Yeah, I mean, my career as a writer springs from my travel, because I just used to keep journals and, listen to as many stories, ask questions, jot things down, and, finally thought I had a novel in some of the things I'd been jotting down. So so a lot of where I've been and people I've spoken to, experiences I've had, have found their way into books.
That's so cool. Yeah.
I mean, I think really I'm a frustrated travel writer. It's probably what I should have done, but it was a way of like bringing some of those travel experiences or some of those exotic places into my writing.
In a manner of speaking, you were sort of traveling here and traveling in the galaxy far, far away.
Apparently, yeah.
I think you and George have things in common in the sense that you were both so interested in world influence from everywhere, because that's one of the most fascinating things learning about Lucas is pulling from Japan, pulling from Africa, pulling from every conceivable direction. Indiana Jones, you wrote some of that. That must have been odd for you because you've actually been to these places. You're kind of like an Indiana Jones.
Yeah, but I never had that hat and that bullwhip, I've been to those places, but yeah.
That must have been really cool.
That was a weird one. The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, because George had me submit the manuscript with footnotes because he wanted it historically accurate. So everywhere I took Young Indy in Paris and, all the things that he went through with Mata Hari, I had to footnote everything, showing like where my sources were, whether it was on-site research. It was crazy. like a term paper.
I love that series, by the way.
Yeah.
Great show.
Yeah.
Now I wanted to ask a little bit about the Aztec mine thing. So you've voyaged everywhere, and we could talk about that, but it stood out to me that you've been to Tikal, which is Yavin 4. And so, what's that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I first went to Tikal and like when most people were flying in. There was the road had just been pushed into the site. It was like probably 1972. And I've been back there so many times, and I have a real attachment to it now for the Maya and for Star Wars.
So when you saw, I know you have a wonderful story of you seeing the first film with Brian. When you're in the theater, and I know he traveled with you, did you ever, when they show that, do you go, I know where I was there?
That Brian hadn't been there yet, but I think I may have even shouted that out.
That's so great. That's wonderful.
I've been traveling to Mayan archaeological sites since probably 1969, when I was like 18 years old when I went down to Mexico for the first time. Visited a Maya site, and it just had that culture imprinted on me. And in the intervening years, I've probably visited 100 archaeological sites down there. In some cases, I've walked for 2 weeks to reach them, with a mule train and full expeditionary kind of gear. So they've just long fascinated me. And in speaking with archaeologists and anthropologists through the years, I was able to really get a sense of what that culture may have been like.
If you could have every Star Wars reader read one of your non-Star Wars books, which one would you want them to be?
It would definitely be this Maya novel. Set during the time of the classic Maya, and it's kind of an action-adventure story.
Lead into my next question. You've traveled a lot. Alan Dean Foster travels a lot, and he spoke about writing a non-fiction book just on his travels. Have you ever considered writing a book on your own experiences?
I actually did, and it was kind of a bittersweet book because years ago, my best friend and frequent collaborator Brian Daly, who's contributed some great novels to the Star Wars universe, when he died, we traveled a lot together, and there was one Mayan site that we always wanted to get to, a very, very remote site. Brian died before we could go there, so I decided that I would take some of his ashes, his cremation ashes, to that site. And I did actually write a kind of a memoir about my relationship with Brian and our long friendship and our travels, and told the story of my efforts to reach this archaeological site.
So that was published?
I know. In the end, it never found a home, and I may make it available as an ebook at some point.
Do you think Brian Daly would have been pretty interested in the Vong, considering you and him were fascinated in these cultures?
I think Brian would have been in my place had he lived. I don't think I would have been involved.
Yeah. Let's say Steve Seffel's in there and he throws it to Daly. Do you think, you knew him best. Do you think he would have had a similar Mayan Aztec?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No, but I'm sure he would have come up with something just as compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brian had a phenomenal imagination. Didn't always draw from real life locations or real life or mythology or anything, but he just had such a fantastic imagination. He would have come up with something.
When they came to him in the early mid-90s to do the Return of the Jedi radio drama, was that fulfilling to him to complete the trilogy finally?
Yeah, there were a couple of close calls before that, and ironically didn't come back to him until literally his dying months.
I'm so glad that he was able to finish it, because he really got me into the Star Wars books, Daly's stuff, so...
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's great. And it was like a little blessing, to have that work come up at the end of his life like that, and to give him something to focus on other than, fighting the disease. So the timing was extraordinary.
And then when you stepped into writing Star Wars, I noticed that you have a tendency to reference some of his old stuff, and you brought back Roa for the New Jedi Order, which took a lot of people by surprise. A lot of people were going, who, Roa, what?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. That's all about sort of tipping my hat to Brian. I'm always, crediting him and tipping my hat whenever I can in any of the Star Wars novels that I work on.
You ended up writing several books in the New Jedi Order series, which involved building on the things that the other writers had created and written, and continuing the story in that respect. Was that a big difference from things you had written before?
Well, the New Jedi Order, I had a lot of direct involvement in the in creating the storyline for that series. So I was very intimately involved with that series. I read all the manuscripts as they came in. I had written the initial treatment for the whole story arc. I worked with folks at Lucasfilm and at Ballantine in sort of structuring that series, breaking it down into books. So it wasn't hard for me to sort of drop into the series for those books. What was difficult for me was I had never written in Star Wars, and I had to sort of get my legs. I had to learn the rules and regulations of this new franchise, and that took me a while.
And of course, you reserved the books that focused big on Han Solo for yourself.
That came about fortuitously. But I was really happy that it worked out that way.
Sort of an homage to Brian Daley.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What was your reaction when they said, "Hey, do you think you could do a book?"
I jumped right in because, especially, it seemed like I was fated to do that only because of, the Han Solo, my connection to Brian and everything. And I figured, oh, this is great. I get to bring a lot of Brian's characters in. I get to think a lot about Brian while I'm writing it. So that felt like, oh, I'm in on this.
I was going to ask you that if, because you were really close friends with him and you guys went on these travels together. Was that in your mind when you're writing about sort of Han dealing with that grief?
Yeah, very much. Very much. Yeah, that I don't know if I dedicated it to him, but I should have if I didn't.
Because I remember you wrote a tribute for him on his page, and it was really moving.
Yeah. He was kind of a mentor to me. We were both writing our first novels when we first met. And so, we had that in common. But it was Brian who kind of brought me into science fiction when he was writing for Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers, this TV show, and sort of made me believe that I could write science fiction. And then, and from that series, we got Robotech together, and I learned more from him about science fiction and fantasy. So he plays the part of a mentor as well as a good friend.
I've heard that for some writers, it's kind of daunting to write action scenes, and you've had to write action scenes based on something that was already filmed or something that was already animated, and then you've had other opportunities to write on things where you're creating these scenes from whole cloth. Which one is harder, or is one just not harder than the other for you?
That was extremely daunting to me in the beginning. I had no background in writing space battles, and Brian had been writing that sort of thing. He had already done a couple of Star Wars novels, so I really looked to what he did and tried to sort of get into his mind and how he approached that. When you're looking at something on a screen, I guess it's a little bit easier because basically you can just take the approach of describing exactly what you see. Creating battle scenes from whole cloth, then you're in your own movie. Then you've got to sort of sit back and try and imagine what's flashing on your inner screen and get all of it down. I still find battle description the most daunting task for me. And for a long time, I tried to avoid it. Even when I first started writing in Star Wars, I would just rather do anything than sit down and write a battle scene. Over time, once I got the vocabulary and once I learned a few tricks by studying people like Stackpole and Zahn and some others, then I became more comfortable with it. But I guess to answer your question, I guess it's always easier to have it in front of you on the screen, just be able to describe it. As long as you have that vocabulary, you don't have to create this battle in your head.
I picked Mike's brain quite a bit, and Aaron's too. And then they came to me only because I knew, where the series was eventually going to head, and they would say, is this going to work? Is this going to work?
Since I'd never taken any writing courses before I became a professional writer, that some of the things I enjoyed most were the collaborations that I had at Lucasfilm with people like Aaron and Troy, or Matt Stover. Those kinds of brainstorming sessions were just so interesting to me, just tossing ideas back and forth.
It reminds me, I noticed I would hear a stray comment from Kathy Tyers. I think she really had a good sense for the heart of the series.
She, as I remember, she was critical of some of the things I was doing, like from a feminist point of view. Like she would weigh in on do you really think that Mara would say this, or do you really want to take this course? Have you ever thought about? She was really influential in helping me shape some of the things that I did.
Oh, wow. And that's really interesting that you say that, because she had Tim Zahn's ear on Mara's character for Balance Point.
Okay.
So maybe that went into those meetings a little bit.
Maybe. Could be.
They were communicating.
Yeah.
It's so funny to me that he didn't work on the series, because he actually came in sideways through 100 different directions.
But it is the Zahnverse.
What's your primary motivation in your storytelling?
I mean, I would like to get readers engaged in characterizations and character arc, transitions in characters. I know that a lot of my books are heavy on plot, but I really try and have the plot spring from characters.
I enjoyed the New Jedi Order tremendously, particularly because it had a very different tone from what I felt was the common tone of the original Star Wars films, and even to a certain extent some of the comic books as well, because it was a much more adult tone.
We just talked about taking a more adult approach to some of the stuff. It was a deliberate move on our part to increase the tension a little bit, rather than just play things easy.
The first book I wrote was called Hero's Trial.
Mm-hmm.
It dealt with Han's grief following the death of Chewbacca. And my thought was, let's approach this in a very adult way. And I tried to do that. In the process, just for the story I'd conceived, I sort of pushed Han away from Leia and had Han go off on sort of a separate adventure to kind of find himself again after the death of his closest friend, his companion for all those years. And I received a lot of flack for doing that, for separating Han and Leia, because many readers just don't want to see the relationships that they've observed in the films. They don't want to see too many great changes, or at least they didn't at the time. A writer has to be careful, because a lot of readers want these characters to remain, or the relationship of the characters to remain unaltered. And so you're always checking yourself when you write these kinds of scenes.
How did you ever come up with the Rin? And was Han's partner in that sort of a Chewbacca replacement since he was dead?
The Rin, the inspiration was a documentary I saw about gypsies, about the Roma people, and I was just really taken with the documentary and thought that tried to imagine a sort of Star Wars version of a gypsy species, for lack of a better word. And originally, we were looking for some sort of replacement for Chewbacca, but the character that I devised for that book just didn't stick. I mean, really, people wanted to see Han, readers wanted to see Han team up with Leia. It became very obvious when the letters started pouring in. So the character just sort of receded into the background.
But you originally intended it to be like a permanent hookup with Han?
I don't know about permanent, but certainly for more than the two books that he was in which he was featured.
Well, I thought he was a very good choice, because unlike Chewbacca, he can actually talk.
It made him a lot easier to write. I'll tell you that much.
And it's funny that we were paying a lot of attention to reader feedback, as the series went on, and it's like when I introduced Droma, and then everyone said, no. We want Leia and Han together. We don't want to see this go in any other direction, So, okay, enough said.
You want to listen to fans, but did you ever feel like, wait, you weren't part of the meeting?
Yeah, of course. But then, you want things to work, so you have to pay attention.
Was it in the early outline or your suggestion to play into that sort of idea of a Jedi schism? Because even though you weren't aware of that, the prequel films coming out in their full sense, it's incredible actually how well it works, because they're questioning how much should we be involved with the government, how far do we get involved in war. These are issues that the movies later on would deal with very heavily. What was your thought process?
I like that notion from the very start. I wanted to have Luke really confused in terms of what his role needed to be as a Jedi, as a warmonger, as just like what is the Jedi's place? I was really intrigued by that notion. That was another thing that sort of got pushed aside a little bit, I thought.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny because it gets tricky because everybody has their own angle throughout the series, but then Jason kind of comes out of left field with an answer, which was neat.
Yeah.
So one of my all-time favorite characters is Vergier, which I heard her name is inspired by a French word. Is this true?
I think her name, the word either translates as garden or it's something like garden.
Right. Can you talk about creating, because it's your creation, can you talk about creating that character and what you had in mind for her?
I remember when, because it was after one of our sessions at Lucasfilm where it was just myself, Shelley, and Sue Rustoni, maybe. We were talking through this business about the hero myth and Jungian archetypes. And Shelley and I went back to San Francisco and went out to some surfer beach, and we were just talking about all this. And I guess I saw her initially as sort of like a shadow or a spy,
Right.
And so I kept playing with that notion of someone being the shadow figure or the person who is going to be the infiltrator, but eventually be able to help the Jedi through the process. And so it was great when I got to insert her into an earlier book, and I didn't see her going quite as dark as she ended up going. That was kind of a surprise to me that the character ended up being almost difficult to read, like you couldn't come down on one side or the other, whether she was this a good character or an evil character. That character got taken in places that I never saw, didn't envision, but I'm very happy about it, especially what Matt did,
Yeah.
That's the cool thing about an organic series, people will just come up with something and it's like, wow, that's great.
Yeah. To take her in that sort of Taoist Zen master direction where she, you have this shadowy, as you said, shadowy mystery figure, but then to say, well, what if that shadow and mystery is because she's unorthodox? What if she's just really speaks in riddles and things, but it's sort of like a light-sided enemy? I had an insight a year or two ago. It just struck me like a bolt of lightning. Vergier has her healing tears.
Mm-hmm.
She has multicolored feathers.
Mm-hmm.
She is there for Jason's rebirth, and she was presumed dead and comes back to life. And I know in China, this particular archetype was seen as the archetype that appears to herald the coming of a new leader. Were you inspired by the Phoenix?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was the whole idea, behind her. I got Chris, my friend Chris, to illustrate like Bergère. Like I had an image in my mind, but I couldn't really see it. So I described her to Chris, and he drew her for me. And I said, yes, that's who I see. And I did that with a couple of other characters too, Droma and some of the other ones.
That's so perfect. It's helpful to have an artist at your disposal.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Now I have to ask this: Walter John Williams, he was interviewed last year, and he said that at one of those story meetings, where you guys are figuring out the end of NJO, he said that someone there, and I have a suspicion who, someone there was suggesting doing a story after the NJO, maybe set about like the droids sort of sentience, their existential stuff, which I know was a storyline that was kind of dropped in NJO. Was that you?
Yeah, I tried to get that going in Agents of Chaos. I thought, hey, this might be a cool side story that we could move, we could even take out of NJO and do something different with at some point, but no one was interested.
Well, I'll tell you who was not in that meeting but might have been interested. I am a huge fan of the behind the scenes. That's why I'm doing this. And I have J.W. Rinzler's incredible books about the making of the original trilogy. And if you read that very first one, it has George's notebook there, and it's got and the last, he has a like 12 movies planned, but the last movie that's planned in there it just says droids, just the droids. So I think you and George have a similar instinct there.
Yeah, and I don't remember. I guess Brian did a comic, called Droids at one time.
The 3PO protocol or whatever.
Yeah. It just seemed to me that it would be cool to use those droids, those characters in a different way. And I remember when Brian was doing the Han Solo books, he was asking George for some kind of input on the characters, because we knew only from the first movie. And and George answered him by adopting the persona of each character, even the droids. Would speak as 3PO and speak as R2D2, and then so he had a feeling for and I guess some people have said that all Star Wars is really the droids through the droids' eyes, right? All the films.
I love that idea.
Yeah.
In fact, the funniest, this is a side thing. The funniest thing, George is such a funny guy. I've gone through his interviews. He has a great sense of humor. And one of the funniest comments I ever heard him make is somebody said, why in every movie R2 saves the day and 3PO is kind of a bumbling idiot. And what's the story there? And George goes, well, it's like that because it's set 100 or 200 years in the future. R2's just remembering this, so he can change the story however he wants. Make himself a hero.
Exactly. Yeah.
The thing that I notice about Brian's works is he's one of the few authors that have made droids point-of-view characters. One of the last things that Brian contributed was an outline, a plot to a comic series, The Protocol Offensive, a one-shot C-3PO story. When you think about memorable droids in the expanded universe, there really aren't that many. We have 3PO and R2, of course, but even in the novels that exist, 3PO and R2 rarely are given the opportunity to really be 3PO and R2. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if, as an author, you could give some insight. I have some theories. I have some theories that there's a desire to give a strong point of view and a strong point of view of emotion, a strong point of view of motive, and trying to extrapolate that to a machine might be daunting, might be difficult. But if you look at the films themselves, R2 and 3PO do not behave like machines. They have very, very humanistic motivations, and that's exactly what Bullocks and Blue Max have as well. I don't know, Jim, if you have any insight about those characters.
I don't have any special insight to offer, but I do share Brian's sort of he'd like to take this point of view from everyone, from evil characters, heroes, and the droids themselves. And I've tried to do the same thing in some of my novels by introducing droids that have a point of view. I think it's very, very important for Star Wars. I mean, perhaps the whole saga is known through the droids, so I think it's really important to do that.
I've always liked the idea, though, that I guess was Lucas's originally, that the entire saga was really being told from the point of view of the droids.
What was your attitude towards the American cover art? How did you see that? Was that close to your vision?
No, I wasn't wild about the covers, to tell you the truth. I mean, they did what they needed to, and to convey, what the book was going to be about. But
yeah,
we're talking about covers. Part of the reason that the covers get out there the way they do is that the art department has 93 covers a month to do at Ballantine Books alone. And the people they're trying to please aren't necessarily the author at all. In fact, the author is sometimes the last one they're going to please. This friend of mine, James Lucino, wrote a novel about Guatemala. And the complaint from one of the salespeople was, can't you make this cover more red? And the editor said, well, there aren't many red jungles out there. We just don't have a lot of those. But red sells. So a lot of red and ochre went onto this cover.
Cover art is such a specialty. For some artists, they can really just give you something that draws you, that stands on itself, on its own. And I don't know that any of the New Jedi Order books fulfilled that.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about that, when I was talking with Greg Keyes, he said that most authors have said they didn't have any input on the cover art, and I presume in your case it's probably similar.
Usually we don't, yeah.
Greg said that because he knew Therese Nielsen, that he had direct input on all of his cover art.
Lucky, yeah. Nice.
And so I said to him, this is Nen Yim, and these are these characters, like, that's what you described. He said, yes, that is exactly.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, that might be the closest that the authors came. Did you ever see those amazing Japanese covers, the Tyoshi Nagano?
Fantastic, right? Yeah. They're great.
To me, there's a holy grail that was never published. He mentioned it in an interview. He said, we were working on doing a coffee table book of my Star Wars paintings, and it fell through. And for me, that
wow. See, that's what you want, like an artist to read these things and then envision them for you, just set it down. Oh, that would have been great. Yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, for me, he's with Drew Struzan with those illustrations.
Right.
I would have loved to see those Nagano covers, maybe a re-release here in America with that, because they are just gorgeous.
They are.
Your stories tie into so many previous works of other authors, overlapping, retelling, intersecting. How much research was involved in order to write this book?
Well, I've been writing in the Star Wars franchise for almost, I don't know what it is now, 8 years. So a lot of this stuff is just in my head. I really did the bulk of my research when I was first invited to kind of help structure the New Jedi Order series. I read every comic, every novel, every source book, essential guide, and made notes, and a lot of that stuff just is still with me, almost like a foreign language when you learn it as a kid. I mean, it's just in your head. But I did have to constantly check myself and open up different source books or open up novels and find out whether I was on the right track and I hadn't botched something.
Related to that, it seems like you, more than most other Star Wars authors, incorporate pre-existing characters and pre-existing species that we've seen in Star Wars before, and that's not used very much in the EU. Is this something you consciously try to do to bring the universe more cohesive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like to, I try my best to make it as realistic as possible, and I mean realistic within the franchise. I mean, I hope that like all of us who have been reading Star Wars for 20 years or whatever and know the movies really well can sort of read a novel in Star Wars and really feel like it's taking place in an alternate universe that we know really well. So I do try and draw on things that that have been used before, so that it really does seem like a real place. I don't want to constantly be making up new planets or making up new species. And also, I like to draw on characters who are interesting visually, so that they conjure images, so that the books tend to become very visual and almost film-like. I'll go back a lot of times to images in the films for just that reason. I'm not trying to cheapen it. I'm just trying to make it a real experience for the reader.
I've talked to, again, other authors about the importance or not of continuity versus, say, verisimilitude. How do you feel about the need for things to have a continuity that is so exacting?
Well, for me as a fan and, as a reader, as someone who's invested a lot of time in Star Wars, I think that continuity is extremely important, because I think the more you can flesh out this universe in a very real way, the more rewarding the reading experience. I mean, I think I come to this from earlier work that I did with Brian Daley in the Robotech universe, where we there, too, were compelled to keep the continuity as close as we could to what was being developed for the animation. So I sort of carried that over into Star Wars, and from the very start, I felt that continuity had to be maintained. It's not always easy, because there's a lot of contradictory events, and you do have to kind of smooth over wrinkles, as you say. But I think if the fans are willing to kind of adjust their thinking a little bit, then you can really keep this sense of continuity going. And like I said, I think it really enhances the reading experience itself.
When you were writing Agents of Chaos, the dilemma with the Centerpoint Station and with Anakin there, and they're trying to make that determination with it. Do we fire this weapon and it could lead to all these casualties or not? Firstly, I mean, Centerpoint Station, that's a throwback, but
that's a throwback. Yep.
And what was your inspiration with that dilemma of? I mean, Thraken is another throwback who comes in and he interferes with that. What was your process? Just your thought when you're writing that end of Agents of Chaos?
Well, I like this notion of putting people in an ethical dilemma. And so, not coming down on one side or the other, hopefully getting readers to try and weigh in, while they're reading. Like, is this a good idea? Is this an ethical choice? But that book was panned. I mean, people hated that book, as far as I know. So obviously, some of the things that I wanted to bring to the series were not well received.
And sometimes I think time might change it, because I haven't seen as much negativity recently, but sometimes it's during the time of release you hear the loudest critics.
Yeah.
I will say, as a shout out to Agents of Chaos and to you specifically, you painted the Falcon black and you brought the E-wings back in, which, hey, listen, I am game for both of those choices.
A black Falcon, yeah. I like that idea.
I think it stayed throughout. Both of those things were regulars throughout the rest of the series.
Yeah, some things, held up.
I just want to give you the toast that Brian always used to raise every time we sat down to open a bottle, which was, to our noble selves, damned few of us left.
Clear skies.
This week, we have a special guest.
I'm Kathy Tyers, now Kathy Tyers Gillen, because I remarried a few years ago. And I have written a number of science fiction novels, including 2 for the Star Wars universe.
Did you get to go to the Skywalker Ranch, or did you sort of have to go to the Skywalker?
Oh, poor me. I went to Skywalker Ranch a couple of times. The first time I got to go was when the Worldcon was held in San Francisco, and Bantam Books held a dinner party for all of their authors. The second time I got to go was when I was getting ready to do my second Star Wars novel, and they had a planning committee. That was the day that I actually saw George Lucas across the room, saw 3PO's actual hand in a display case. The golden idol from Raiders of the Lost Ark was in the same display case. It was an amazing experience.
And that's just, you're literally kind of, everyone's there to learn what's permissible in a Star Wars novel. Like, why are they gathering you guys all together?
Well, for that particular one, they were going to create a series. It was going to be held together by 5 hardcover novels, each of which was going to have a main pivot point element in the storyline. And they were still kind of ironing out the storyline. The first book had been released. A major character dies in the first book. So in my book, they were like, so who's going to die in your book? I not want to kill anybody. And somebody has the bright idea, let's kill Luke Skywalker. And I said, you can't kill Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker is Star Wars. And Lucy Autry Wilson, who was Mr. Lucas's personal assistant, turned to me and said, you get it.
We're back. Hey, we've got Kathy on the phone, so let's dive into this interview, and we'll get going. Kathy, you with us?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I just wanted to intro. Kathy Tyers has honored us by joining us tonight. We're very honored. Many of you are familiar with her first works, such as the Teresa Veruca, and I know I'm saying that wrong. We Don't Do Weddings, which is one of her more popular short stories, and of course Balance Point, which is the big news. However, she's also penned the Firebird series, which includes Firebird, Fusion Fire, Crown of Fire. She's also written Crystal Witness, Shivering World, One Mind's Eye, and you also got a travel book out called Exploring the Northern Rockies, which I've just got to pick up. Really interested in that.
Need it for your coffee table.
And then also including 2 folk music albums. So first let me jump in with our standard open questions. With as many talents as you have, what's brought you into the Star Wars universe?
I just have enjoyed Star Wars for a long, long time. Was in line to see within the first week of when it opened in our little town in Montana, standing in line with the rest of the fans and enjoying it like crazy.
Who's your favorite character?
Luke Skywalker.
Okay. Have to say that. What made you become a writer?
I have had a number of jobs. When I was first out of college, I went back to work immediately in the microbiology department at my university because I was a microbiology major and was in Phillips School. After that, I taught elementary school for 3 years, quit to have a family, and when my son was 2 years old, and these wonderful children who love to spend time entertaining himself in the afternoon or else taking long naps, I decided to do something for my own personal development, something that I would enjoy, something that would maybe more than just mother a child, and decided to write some science fiction for fun. It so happened that that very same summer, Return of the Jedi had just come out. That was also the summer of our town's centennial, and the Air Force Thunderbirds came to town, so I rather had Star Wars Hypercraft on my mind. So when I decided to do some writing for fun, it was science fiction.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that sounds cool. Nice. So what kind of process do you go through when you write a novel? Do you outline it mentally? And basically what I'm asking is, what technique for writing?
Oh boy. I don't know if there is a technique for writing so much as there's a story that reaches out and grabs you, or else there isn't. I am a character writer. I try to start with a person in a dangerous situation, and so first I have to come up with what is their universe, what is their situation, who is this character, where are they from. My main characters so far have predominantly been female in my own work because, you know, they say write what you know, and I happen to know women better than I know men. I've been married to a fellow for a number of years, and I'm starting to get to him a little bit, I think. But anyway, if I'm going to set about writing a novel, I will start with a character and spend a few days to get inside that character's skin, find out what they've been through, what their lives have been like, where do they hurt, where's their problem, and then build a story around that. The Star Wars novels have been just a little bit different because they start with a plot. They start with events that you are going to write. I then took those characters, those basic plots, and expanded them, came up with the themes by which the story will be told. Develop and expand that until you have a good solid outline. I also keep a notebook for any books that I have under construction. In that notebook, I'll have a sheet for each character with their pretty long and solid characterization, what they like, what they dislike, what you would find in their pockets, if you could go through their pockets, which tell a lot about them, what sense of humor is like, what their attitude, military knowledge, what is the rank system, for example, for their particular branch of service. Once I have enough information that I can fill about 20 pages of outline, I'm generally ready to start writing the novel. Then the first draft is pretty much straight through as quickly as I can write, which is not very fast. I'm not nearly as fast as Jim Lucino or Mike Stackpole. I'm much, much slower. I don't know if that's because I am struggling to get inside everybody's skin while I'm watching them walk through the scenes and figure out what would this person really do or just what the difficulty is. But I do write quite slowly. Once I'm all through my first draft, then I'll go back and edit and edit and edit and polish and edit some more until I feel like it really is starting to look like something I could show an editor. So that's, I guess, in a very large nutshell, that's basically how I write a book.
Okay. That wasn't a loaded question at all. Expanding on that a little bit, do you ever feel blinded by Star Wars books with such an impressive range of novels in your past? Want to move in a direction that wasn't possible in the Star Wars universe?
No, There's another loaded question. I am familiar enough with the Star Wars universe that I think I have a pretty good feel of where it is wanting to go. Who is Luke? Who is Leia? Who is Han? As well as the more recent introductions, of course, the Solo Kids and Droma, and all these wonderful characters that have been brought in by the other authors. I really try to make a novel go where the characters want it to, if at all possible. One of the wonderful things that happened while I was getting ready to write Ballast Point was that Shelley Shapiro at Del Rey and I worked very closely on the outline for the novel. We went through many, many versions of the outline until we had something that was not only what I felt the characters would do, but also what was needed by the New Jedi Order story arc.
Okay. Wow. Excellent. It sounds like the way you write very methodical and precise. It's not.
I don't know if I would call it methodical and precise so much as emotional, because I really don't want to try and force these characters into situations that I honestly don't think they would do. Now, I know that my perception of them characters is different from some other fans' perceptions of those characters, and I can absolutely not, because Star Wars is such an enormous universe, and the characters are so mystic and so big that they appeal to a large number of personality types, and many of us are projecting little bits of ourselves onto these characters as well. So when we write our fan fiction, and really my Star Wars fiction is fan fiction too, we tend to sometimes get little bits of ourselves creeping in there with the other characters, and I would like that.
What was the feeling when you got the notification that you were going to write in the NJO?
What I got was an invitation, and believe it or not, my first reaction was, I better pray about this, because I had already gotten my Firebird trilogy going full steam for Bethany House. It was something I had wanted to do desperately for many years, ever since the series was not finished when I was starting to write it for Bantam Books. And so I felt that I was moving in a direction that was very important to me spiritually, and I thought, I would love to write Star Wars again. Is this the right thing to do? So I took some time and was able to decide, yes, this would be a very good thing to do. And so I was able to do both of these things that I wanted to do very passionately.
Awesome. All right. Well, we know you collaborated with other authors to write Ballast Point, obviously. How much did they really input into story?
The cooperation between the New Jedi Order authors isn't really what I would call collaboration. I would call a collaborative novel when you are actually writing the chapters together with someone. What we did, though, was much more complex. I was brought into the series after Vector Prime had written. Mike Apple and Jim Lucino were in the process of writing their novels, and so there was, I was able to get a good idea right at what had been written, and of course given the story arc and told what was going to happen after, of course, I signed the confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. And as you all know, we all have an implant in our brain, and if we try to answer the wrong question, it will explode, causing a horrendous mess and loud noises, and probably put Jedi Talk Radio on the air. So I can't talk about any of that. But I will say that working with Jim and working with Mike was a hoot. Those guys know Star Wars very, very well. And so since I cooperated with them to the extent of being able to ask them questions, read their manuscripts before they were published, even get response to some of them. Also, I was able to be in touch with Tim Zahn and to have him vet some of the scenes in which some of his characters appeared. It was a kick in the pants. I really enjoyed working with those guys. I respect them very much.
Was Writing Balance Point different than some of the other Star Wars projects you had? And if so, how was it different?
The biggest difference for me in writing Balance Point was that it had to follow a pre-planned story arc pretty closely. I was assigned certain events, and they had to take place during my novel. I had absolute artistic freedom how to show them. And as I said before, Shelley Shapiro and I hammered out the outline until she was satisfied, and then that was submitted to Lucasfilm for approval. Now, when I wrote before for Star Wars, The Truth of the Kura, I basically had a phone call from my editor at Benson Books. Janice Overstein happens to be sitting in my office at this moment, spending the weekend with me, and is at my pussycat here and smile. Okay, here, Janice says hello. Okay. Anyway, she called and asked, would you like to write a Star Wars novel? And I said, let me think about this. Yes. And then we did a conference call on Friday, and I pitched some plot ideas. So the beginning of the writing process was very different. Another difference this time at Balance Point is that there is now an enormous body of literature with which the fans are intimately familiar, and with which the writers are familiar with varying degrees. So we have wonderful people, resource people, at Lucasfilm, at Del Rey. Also, some of the authors have become specialists in certain areas of the Star Wars universe. It's a huge, huge help. So I have a lot more to be up on this time around. Now, with Truth of the Kura, it was wonderful because basically to do my research, I had to make a big bowl of popcorn and pop the videos into the player and watch, again, taking really good notes. You know, what color are Han Solo's eyes really, and so forth, because The Truth of the Kura is placed before any of the other original trilogy movies. So there were a lot of big differences. However, there were a lot of major similarities. The characters, the main characters, are the same. However, they have matured. Now, fortunately, I too am 20 years older than I was back then, so I am looking at life from a slightly different perspective. So, yes, for example, I tried to write from the perspective of a woman who has been married to the same man for 20 years, who has been through all kinds of wonderful and hellacious predicaments with this person, and with whom the relationship has mellowed to something that is not the wild, explosive, blinding passion of youth, but is the long, steady, strong, burning flame of long-lasting love. Long answer again, sorry.
No problem. We like the long answer. Yeah. I gotta reel it back to Leia here for a minute.
Sure.
I noticed that in Truth you had Leia dealing with the fact that Anakin Vader was her father. And let's just say you didn't really make it easier on her on Balance Point. Do you not like her?
I love Leia. I think she is a fabulous, strong female character. She is also our point of view character within the power structure. And so she is the character through whose eyes you tend to see in Star Wars novels the political structure. She tends, therefore, to kind of be there, the witness to a lot of power plays and manipulation and so forth that's going on. And she tends not to be present for the battle scenes and so forth unless you really stretch things, because let's talk about this. Let's talk about the planet we live on. Just how often is a chief of state anywhere close to battle or a duel or anything like that? So to have Leia involved in what was going on really took some hard thought, and she was definitely involved in trying to keep her family together. She was as passionate about the refugees in the New Jedi Order as she has been about the refugees from Alderaan. She is a very caring, very deeply loving woman who gives her not only to people in general, but to her husband and to her family. So she's a character about whom I feel very deep. So I know it has been said in some places, I must not like Leia. Let me please put that to rest. That is absolutely not true.
Yeah, you beat up on her.
I beat up on all my favorite characters. Listen, if you read my Firebird book, you will know that my characters, my very favorite characters, are the ones that come within an inch of death because the people care about them.
That's true. Well, I mean, that's the first. It's one of the first books that I've really been real passionate about Leia again. It's like, what's going to happen to Leia? A lot of the authors have sheltered her a little bit. Use her right there in the mix. And
I think that her in the mix is where Leia would choose to be if he could.
Well, that's
Leia's my age now, though. I mean, we're talking old enough to be a grandma. And it's really tough to get out there and swing your lightsaber. I think she's still got it in her. I would not be surprised. I mean, I don't know what the other authors are going to be doing Leia from this point. I have been asked many times, will she be able to be up on her feet and out there doing what Jedi should do in the next books? And I have to say, I don't know, but I definitely left that as a possibility on purpose.
Sure. In Balance Point, we were opened up, or you were opened up to a whole new range of characters you didn't have access to before, and out of this new crop of characters, who's your favorite? Which ones do you like to write the most?
You better give me a list then, because I'm not sure who you consider new and who you consider not so new.
Anakin, Jason, Jaina, Mara, Droma.
Yes, Mara. I love writing Mara. I will confess. I have a great time writing Mara.
Well, she's definitely one of the most popular characters in the expanded universe, and she is great.
I will confess that when Jana sent me a copy of Tim Zahn's first Star Wars novel, and I read that absolutely elegant dance across Myrkr with, she's going to kill him, and she has to keep him alive to get there. I said, that's woman. That's the one. I wrote Tim Zahn a letter, said, that's her. And he said, I don't know yet, so that's fine.
And he also asked, have you seen Shannon back as the face of Mara Jade? Since you liked Mara, what did you think of her?
I thought she was a good choice. I have on my bulletin board that I keep my computer for inspiration, I have a picture that somebody posted of Luke and Mara, Luke in his Return of the Jedi costume, and a slightly altered Shannon Bax picture side by side. And at first I thought, no, that's not the way I see her. And in time, like any other things, it's definitely grown, and I can see them together.
What was your favorite part about writing Balance Point? I mean, what was the favorite part that you got to write?
My favorite point that I got to write about was when I went to the planning session meeting at Skywalker Ranch, and I was told that this series was going to take, the New Jedi Order series would be some years after the concluding books of the Bantam series. Almost the first question I had was, well, do Luke and Mara have children yet? And no, and I kind of perked up and went, ooh, can I do that? And it was a little more complicated and long at getting the idea approved, but I was very hopeful that this would be something that would be allowed, because I felt so strongly that the Skywalker name go on.
Definitely. That was, wrote it in. Yeah, that's either the new hope or the new death of the galaxy, the way we see it.
Unfortunately, that is in the hands of other authors.
You don't have to touch on that. One of our listeners also asked, his name is Urza, and he asks, what would you like to see, a little boy Skywalker or a little girl Skywalker?
I think that's been decided in the book already. Actually, if you read it carefully, you'll find it.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I mean, was that more your decision or somebody else's?
I made the proposal, and they did not edit it out.
Well, there you go. Okay. I just want to expand on that. With you did write a lot about Anakin. Was that more that was crucial to the series without setting your plants off, obviously? Was there some setup going on there?
It's buzzing. I have to be careful. Anakin, I enjoy all three of the Solo children. When I took the New Jedi Order job, I will confess I did not feel that I knew any of them well enough to write them. And I did a lot of research, and I really studied what was being written about them in the reference materials, what there had been written in the Bantam series, and then also what Bob Salvatore and Mike and Jim had written up to that point about the kid, to get a feel for each one of them. And then, as I said before, I really tried to spend hours inside their skin for each one of them and trying to see what are their issues, what are their current strengths and weaknesses, what are their passions, what do they want more than anything. And so I did try and bring each one of them forward just a little more, develop each one just a little more as a character.
All right, I got a question for you. In Balance Plate, Jason Solo, he had an awful lot of emotional issues, and I was wondering, how was that to cover with him? Was that difficult for you to write, or did you have a pretty easy time with it?
This was, for me, the main thrust of the novel. Jason having to make his choice, Jason's pivotal moment. And so it was difficult because it was very important, and I needed to get right. We did spend a lot of time hammering this out in the outline. If Jason has to make these decisions, how are we going to choose scenes that show him acting it out? It was suggested that it would have to be a member of his family, or even possibly his higher family, a life or death. You know, you're going to use the Force, aren't you? And so that's tricky to set up within the parameters of his character, within the parameters of Star Wars. How do you get enough people in place to play this out so it flows naturally? When you know ahead of time the event you're aiming for, you have to make sure that you're not trespassing on character development. And that was a real balance point for me, frankly, was the plot and character, because I want to write character-driven novels. At least if plot has been decided ahead of time, I want it to feel as if the characters chose to drive the plot in that direction.
Okay. Okay. Going back a little bit to where Jason was having this emotional trials of determining whether he'd use the Force or not. He said he put in a critical position where part of his family or all of his family needed to be put in a position so he could make that choice or have made that choice. You feel, having crawled in with Jason and kind of and how you view character development, do you think that if it had been anybody other than Leia, do you think would have made the same choice?
I don't know. I will confess that I am the mother of a son, and that the mother-son relationship is one that I know something about, and I kind of put myself into that situation and thought, yeah, I can make it work this way, so that's why I did it this way.
As far as villains go, which did you like writing more? Did you like writing the Bung or the Searock?
I don't really enjoy writing villains at all, partly because of the way I do write. As I said, I really try and spend some time inside my character's skin and try and feel with them, try and establish who they are and why and how they are going to react, and really try, just a little while to become a point of view character in any particular scene, because if I can't empathize with the point of view character, I don't think the readers will be able to. I think that will come through in the finished product.
I certainly hope you don't have an embrace of pain in your home.
You must be joking. No, I don't. And so, to be perfectly honest, I would just have to say none of the above. I do not. I know that you have to include some point of view scene from your villains in a science fiction, especially space opera novel, and I try and make them as short as possible and convey as much information as possible, so I don't have to spend extra time editing those chapters over and over. And they also get the smallest amount of editing because, as I said, I don't feel comfortable there.
especially with such an evil, vile, and disgusting as the Yuuzhan Vong.
Yeah.
In some of your research materials, do you ever go back to the Star Wars RPG, particularly the older one, because they have so much source material on it? Did you ever go back and look at that for any of your writing?
Absolutely. I have a lot of their source material. Bantam sent me a wonderful box of West End Games material, and they have some great references, and I do use those.
Awesome. Cool. Do you find it more difficult to write in the Star Wars universe or with your own creations?
There are different kinds of difficulty, really. When you're doing your own creation, you have to do it scratch. When you are doing it in a pre-established universe, you have to be accurate and established. And each one of those has its own perils and its own level of difficulty. I find making it up from scratch more emotionally exhausting, but I think I probably spend more time with detail work trying to get it right with an established universe.
Awesome. Cool.
Okay. I know we touched on this a little bit already, but how did you feel about writing, coming in and putting your chapter, if you will, in coming in the middle, as opposed to set off or maybe finishing up later on?
It felt a little bit like real life. We're born into a family. We are raised in a particular situation. We have constraints that are put on us. We are allowed to act out many of the scenes ourselves, but after making some basic life choices, our direction is restricted. We can make certain choices and we can't make some.
How much input did you have, if any, on the cover art?
I have had no input on cover art. But the cover art is generally designed by an art director and an artist after the manuscript has been written.
Right.
So yes, with some input from the author, that's true, and the editor give suggestions. This would be a good thing to illustrate and so forth. But it was a real eye-opener to me when I was told some years ago that the main purpose of a book jacket is not to illustrate the book, really. It's to sell the book to the people who will enjoy that particular book. So whereas there could be details that are not accurate, don't look exactly like the characters would, or the scene is not set up like the scene exactly was set up, the point is that the cover art needs to say, to those of you who like this kind of book, here it is. And I think, in fact, Jan and I were just talking this afternoon, that I have been blessed with, I think, some of the nicest covers in Star Wars fiction. Somehow, I am so grateful to the powers that be for giving me that beautiful cover for The Truth of Bakura and that dynamite, active, question-raising cover for Balance Point. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. They did a spectacular job on both those covers. And once again, it's kind of a mute point. I mean, they could have a black cover with the Star Wars logo that says story number 46. So going, goodness.
They could.
As soon as it says Star Wars out there, we're good. Open up our wallets and obligingly empty them.
Fortunate that they don't. That they come up with these beautiful pieces of.
They do.
Yeah.
How did you feel about the fan reception? I mean, has it been mostly positive, or?
I've been really honored and flattered by the fan reception. I'm very grateful for the people who have liked it as well as they have. I have had some responses that have not been overwhelmingly positive, of course. As I said, everyone's vision of Star Wars is going to be just slightly different because we're all seeing this enormous mythology from a slightly different perspective. But I'm so grateful, and I really do feel that, in a way, I want to be writing books that they would like to write if they were assigned the same events that I was assigned to write.
All right. Thanks, Kathy, so much for joining us, and you're welcome on Jedi Talk.
Thank you, folks. You take care.
Okay. May the Force be with you.
You too.
Kathy Tyers, in one of her New Jedi Order books, sent me a copy of the manuscript before it was finalized with all the Mara spots tabbed. This was before, internet stuff where she could just email and I could search. So to see if I'd gotten her voice and actions correct. And Mike and I have bounced stuff back and forth when we were both writing Star Wars. It largely depends on, I think, the social contacts the authors have to begin with, as to how much back and forth there is.
We're talking to a guy who has done his share of comic books and novels and even some television as well. Michael Jan Friedman, very prolific writer. We've had him on before, and I'm happy to welcome him back. Good to see you, Mike.
Thanks for having me on.
Did you write this trilogy, or is he just making an observation that doesn't involve you?
I actually did write it's a long story. I wrote a Star Wars trilogy that was not published. Because of some business reasons. They were in between the first and second movie, and the first movie had tanked when it came to licensed revenues, and they didn't want that to happen again. And this was part of the originally conceived 26-book New Jedi Order series with the Yuuzhan Vong, and this is going to be part of it. And then they realized, wait a second, it's more important that these hardcover novels do well, and because they're kind of bellwethers for how merchandising is going to go with regard to the second movie. So we don't make that much on publishing anyway. Let's get some of these New Jedi Order books out of there, and not compete with ourselves, so that the hardcovers do better. And so I was a victim of that, but not really, because they paid me. They were very professional about it, and I really have no complaints. But I did do a Jedi trilogy. I didn't do that one. Nonetheless, I'm happy to take credit for it.
There were lots of times that I couldn't write the thing I wanted to write. For instance, I once had a contract to do a trio of Star Wars books, and in the middle of what I was doing, they told me, "Well, yeah, we're getting rid of this. We'll pay you, but we can't, can't publish it because the movie one tanked, and franchisees are jumping ship all over the place. So we need to have a solid performance from our hardcovers that are covering the gap between 1 and 2, because people see them as a bellwether for how the licensed products are going to go entering the second movie. So they had this Yuuzhan Vong arc that was like 26 books, and they gutted it because they didn't want to compete with their own hardcovers. So I was one of the what I was doing was not critical to the overall arc, so I was the first victim.
Do you know anything about the unpublished Star Wars materials, like New Jedi Order books, or were those totally glossed over because they were never published, thus never really happened?
The New Jedi Order ones, I remember that was going to be a couple of novels by Michael Jan Friedman, I think, and I saw those as they were coming out, and that was, again, another reason. I'm not exactly sure why they were canceled, but it was going to be more, that plot line was more about how the Jedi established the Great River, which was this sort of underground railroad that they set up when they were wanted by the Yuuzhan Vong, put a bounty on their heads, and how they all were going to get to freedom. And I don't know that there's a lot of missing stuff from those anymore, because when the Michael Jan Friedman books were canceled, the plot thread of establishing the Great River kind of got picked up by other books. So I don't know that there's any great lost stories or anything going on there. But that happens. You get pretty far along with some things, and for one reason or another, they won't happen. I have a couple of books that I've written that never got published, but you salvage what you can, and maybe some of it can still see the light of day in some other way.
Now, in terms of Nightfall, the trilogy fell through. I mean, were there elements of that didn't make their way into the other books that were lost?
I wasn't one who was in favor of rejecting that trilogy. I liked those books, or the first manuscript. I liked it. And I think some of what was in Nightfall did get picked up along the way.
That would have focused on Danny and maybe the droids a little bit.
Yeah. He was picking up on a lot of things that had been jettisoned or were in jeopardy of being forgotten. And he brought a lot of that stuff in. But again, see, there were three of us there constantly, not butting heads, but, all wanting to go in our own direction. And so you just have to compromise at some point, or it gets very bad. It gets very uncomfortable.
I was going to ask you, the books Nightfall, right? Them were a trilogy that was supposed to happen, but didn't happen.
Del Rey and Lucasfilms were picky enough about the New Jedi Order that they weren't going to publish something that was just clearly outside of what it needed to be, even though they still had to pay for it to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
But there was an accountability there that came, I believe, mostly from Lucasfilms. To their credit, I mean, because of the way publishing works, they would have paid those authors something. Maybe not the full amount, but there's something called a kill fee, right? So if you enter in good faith into writing a book for a franchise and for whatever reason they choose not to accept it, they still pay you
something.
They still pay you something, right?
Yeah, there were, like I said, there were three or four, maybe five books that never made it. And the series was going to be longer initially.
Right.
It was trimmed in the end.
Today's guest, I was super excited for, Mr. Greg Keyes, the author of the Star Wars New Jedi Order series duology, Conquest and Rebirth, and then later on, The Final Prophecy. How did you initially get involved in this project?
Around that time, Del Rey acquired the license to do the Star Wars books, right? Okay. So it was a publisher that was familiar with me. They knew I could meet a deadline. They liked the way I wrote. And they were trying something new. They were recruiting people that had not otherwise done Star Wars, right? They were recruiting people who had made names for themselves writing original work or doing something else. Okay. And at the time they first mentioned Star Wars to me, I was just really, really busy with some other things. I wasn't entirely sure, to be honest, that I wanted to do franchise work because I was doing okay. I mean, I was a huge Star Wars fan. Don't get me wrong. I first saw that movie in A New Hope in 9th grade, and it was a movie I had been waiting to see all my life. Right.
Perfect timing.
And my brother and I, less than a week later, were wailing away on each other with lightsabers made out of wooden dowels.
Yeah.
So I was a big Star Wars fan. But I was a little intimidated by it, because there were already a bunch of books in the expanded universe written by authors that people really loved, right? Like Zahn, like Stackpole. So I was a little intimidated to get involved. So I actually took a pass on the first time I was offered it. And then I ended up doing some books for a television show called Babylon 5, which I was also a big fan of. And at the time, I thought it was the best science fiction show on television. And I was really happy to write those books. It was a good experience. And so when Star Wars came back around, I was like, okay, maybe I'm ready for this. Maybe I can do this. And then I was offered Star Wars. And I guess Terry Brooks, who also lived in Seattle, had just done Star Wars. And, I kind of asked him what he thought about it. He said, do it. And I, of course, love Star Wars. When I first saw that, when that first ship came over, I just started grinning, and I didn't stop, I don't think, until the end of the movie. So agreed to do that. Another thing that happened there was that I had not read everything that had been published up until then in the expanded universe. I'd read the first few, I'd read some here and there, but especially after I started writing, I stopped reading so much fiction because I felt like I should be writing. This sort of goes to the intimidation factor. So when I agreed to do it, I was friends with Michael Stackpole. I had run into him a number of times at conventions, and we'd had some good conversations. And he wrote the Rogue Squadron books, which a lot of people really, really liked. And I said, Mike, what do I absolutely have to read before I start this? And he gave me a list. He says, you have to read this, you have to read this. I had to read, for instance, the first Thrawn book. So I read as much as I could, given the deadline that I had, so that I would have a background on what was going on, like who these characters were. So many of those characters, like Mara Jade, for instance, Corran Horn, they're not in the movies, right? So background in the movies is not sufficient to write in the expanded universe. So that was fun. It was fun coming up to speed on all that, and then I wrote the books. By that time, they had plotted out the general story arc of the New Jedi Order. And so what they did was they said, well, here's your piece of it. What will you do with that? So, I had a general idea of what the arc was about. I knew what had happened up until then. And then I wrote basically outlines for what I would do for Conquest and Rebirth, which I got the contract for those at the same time. And, we went through several rounds of that won't work, or this will work, or, there was a process that involved me and involved the editor at Del Rey, who was Shelley Shapiro. It involved Sue Rastani, who was the person who was our contact with Lucasfilms. She was the person that vetted all of the book stuff at the time. So it was and at times we actually consulted with some of the other authors too.
Were you at those story meetings? I know Aaron Alston was at it so late he wasn't able to attend them. Were you able to go to Skywalker Ranch and sit in there?
I was never at Skywalker Ranch. I was on a lot of conference calls, which is, sort of the equivalent of the Zoom meeting, I guess, in the 90s. So I would be on a call with like Sue Rastani, who was the liaison with the ranch. I did do a lot of brainstorming.
I was curious if they sent you an outline of, okay, here's what our plans are.
I mean, I read the books that were already published, right? Yeah. So, and I knew what was going to happen in the books after mine. So I knew what I was setting up, right? Not in extreme detail, but I knew what I was setting up.
One thing that I noticed is, in Edge of Victory, it's characters that appeared in mainly the Junior Jedi Knights books.
Yes.
Was it a conscious choice to go for those, or was it more of a directive, here's the characters you'll need to use for the story, so now go with it?
Okay, what happened was I was supposed to write a book basically about Anakin. But, yeah, and so Anakin Solo had mostly appeared in the Junior Jedi books. And so my question was, do we pretend these books didn't happen? And the answer is no. Okay, well, then what the heck happened to his best friend?
Tahiri,
yeah. What happened to the little bunny Jedi that trained them both, Ikrit?
Yeah, the Jedi Master Rabbit.
So it was a little, but since I was working with Anakin, I felt compelled to use those characters. And I felt compelled to try to grow them up, and do something interesting with them if we were to grow up Anakin after all.
Anakin in this book, he really stood out. He disobeyed Luke and went off to try to save everyone on Yavin 4. I meant to bring up the Lambent crystal from Anakin's lightsaber and how he could actually sense the Vong when he found that.
Right, because he's incorporating their technology into his stuff. Yeah.
That was something you came up with and that you wanted to
it was, even though it was part of the... I guess we're far enough out from this that I'm free to say that even though when the series started, one of the things that was always in place was where the Thevong couldn't be sensed in the Force.
Right.
They weren't involved in the Force. But nobody knew why. There wasn't an explanation for it.
Right.
Initially.
Right.
It was just a precondition. But my books, again, we were supposed to start seeing a bit of a turnaround, right? An early sign that the Jedi might be able to do something about this. And so that was part of it, but it is something I pitched. It was my idea. that maybe if he incorporated Vong technology, then in some way, since it's all living and to a certain extent connected, if he bridges that gap, then maybe, it's not as good as the Force. It's not as but it's better than nothing, which is what they have against the Vong. And it was just also an early exploration of what might be going on there.
Vu Rapong, bringing him in to work with Anakin, like I didn't see that coming at all. That was very interesting.
Yeah, at that point, I think it was time to start seeing the Vong as something more than one dimensional.
Break it down. Yeah, it seems the further along in the series, it gets more complex with them. They unveil more of kind of what they are and what their purpose is, rather than just ruthless villains that come in and pillage everything.
And they have factions; they're not all in agreement, right?
Right.
So just like the Republic. I mean, so. But anyway, yeah, that was actually a lot of fun. That's kind of what sold me, to a certain extent, on the idea of doing those books, that I would get to do that.
Conquest, it's like the most enjoyable, almost road trip movie.
Right.
And Anakin. It reminded me of one of my favorite stories, which is Gilgamesh.
Sure.
And you have Enkidu there, and you have Gilgamesh, and Voix there. Just those interesting conversations between him and Anakin. That definitely made Anakin into a character that, I mean, he was a fan favorite before, but it really solidified that feeling with him. There's a portion of Conquest where he sees Vu Rapong die, and he thinks to himself, "I hope I go out at least as well as Ra did."
I always knew Anakin was going to die. I mean, part of my job was to make him look like the new Luke, and then I knew they were going to kill him. And I was happy enough that it wasn't going to be me that did it, because I got kind of attached to him. I'd read some of the Junior Jedi books and the Jedi Academy books and so forth that Kevin Anderson must have, and I was like, well, where's Tahiri? That was his best friend. I realized those were kid books, but she should be here somewhere,
right?
So I was kind of responsible for pulling her into it, and I think that she became a good character. She ultimately became this sort of tragic, powerful character. So I was really happy about that, what eventually went on with her. And I actually had kind of fun growing her up.
You made her your own character.
I had an interesting time with that. Sometimes I approach, especially things like Star Wars, that way. I kind of start thinking in terms of more sort of like a fan in a way, right? Like she was kind of left behind, and I was like, well, I know these books that she was in are for kids, but she's his best friend, and unless you're gonna make that not canon for some reason, why isn't she around? Where is she? Why haven't we seen her at all? What? Okay, maybe a lot of people don't love those Jedi Academy books or whatever, or the Junior Jedi books, but they happened,
right?
and Tahiri's in them, so can I have her? And they said, yeah.
When I think about New Jedi Order, I think about the big battles and stuff, but when you start thinking about the character development moments, the thing that first pops into my mind is the scene where Anakin and Tahiri have the first kiss.
Yeah, the locker.
I don't know.
It was a great scene. It was a great scene.
Tahiri, that whole with her and the Shapers was wild.
I think that's one of the reasons they wanted me for those books with my anthropological background.
Yeah.
Because they wanted me to do something that hadn't really been done yet with the Yuuzhan Vong. First of all, to create a character that's somewhat relatable, like Nin Yim's not in any way an unalloyed villain, right? Nin Yim has an agenda. She's got her own stuff, but hopefully at times you root for her a little bit. And also Vu Rapong, the guy that teams up with Anakin, right? But I was the first one that got to explore the Shaper cast, and that was extremely interesting to me. To be able to sort of draw on that background my anthropological background is sort of to come up with this cast and how they related to the rest of the Yuuzhan Vong world. Because up to then, we'd only seen really the worst, like, sadists in that whole culture, right? Like the worst, like, sadomasochists, like the warrior types that, and the religious types that weren't, they're just villains, right? There's nothing okay about them.
Yeah, the Shapers were just, it was kind of eerie too, of what they did to Tahiri. Yeah, like, right. So did you come up with that whole plan to implement that on your, like, kind of show them, like, hey, this is what I'm thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I outlined it. I didn't just write it, because I might have been asked to replace it or write something different. So I did outline it. But like I said, Tahiri was not going to be in the New Jedi Order until I started saying, well, why isn't she? You know?
Yeah.
And then it just kind of followed from there, you know, like what happened to her with them.
When I read Edge of Victory, it struck a chord with me, and I loved the Voix Rapung character. I just wanted to ask, you know, when you were making Conquest, you know, when you were writing that, it's something you're really good at, is contrasting beliefs and values. It's amazing, the conversations. And I could tell that interests you. I just wanted to know, is that something that, did they say to you, like the story group, did they say, hey, we want you to kind of do something like that? Or was that something where you just kind of came to the table and said, hey, I got this?
Well, kind of a little of both. I think that one of the reasons they chose, so I was, you know, already published by Del Rey at that point, and up until then, most of the stuff they had published had been original work of mine. I had done a couple of Babylon 5 books, but mostly I had done original stuff, you know, and I was an anthropology grad student at the time. And so I think, I can't remember if this was explicit, but I got the feeling anyway that what they wanted me to do, up until then, the Yuuzhan Vong had just been portrayed as just these, like, sadomasochistic assholes, right? And there wasn't nothing about any of them that was relatable, really, unless you, I guess, were like that. So I think that they wanted, you know, but we had also only seen a couple of the casts, right? We hadn't seen the Shapers, and Vu Rapung, of course, is not a Shaper, but Nen Yem was, and I think explicitly they wanted me to come up with stuff about the Shaper cast, like what are these people like? And Vu Rapung, I think, is more the second thing of me going, like, yeah, I'm going to make this guy that's sort of an outcast, and his values are going to be very different from, like, Anakin's, but somehow they're going to make it work.
Yeah.
So I guess it was a little of both, but I think they did choose me because of my background with other cultures, because I not only was a grad student, but I also had, you know, lived some other places, and I was doing field work at the time. So I think they thought I could bring something to the table that hadn't been brought there yet. And I think that they, I mean, you know, after the initial sort of shock and awe, they wanted to start making the Yuuzhan Vong a little more complicated.
I would assume from your background with anthropology and other things, like, you really liked that, because the Vong have, like, different layers to them. Right. Their society, their culture, everything about them is different. I mean, you got a degree in anthropology. What interested you to do the anthropology? Like, how did that?
You know, probably the same things that attracted me to science fiction and fantasy, because, you know, like the first thing you see when you see anthropology is how it's studying difference, like cultures you don't understand, cultures you haven't had contact with. And pretty quickly, when you're an anthropologist, you realize actually a lot of it's less about that and more about how we're all the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And there's also the fact that I was immersed for a couple of years in Navajo culture, which was quite different from where I grew up in Mississippi, and was quite fascinating to me. And really, that has influenced my fiction a lot, because living on a landscape where people can tell you where every rock came from mythologically, or there, such and such a spirit lives in that place, and you have to approach it in this way. To see the world like that as alive, as a kid, I sort of took it for granted, but as I got older, I started having questions about it. And anthropology is sort of the discipline to answer those questions.
You mentioned the Native Americans. You had grown up on a Navajo reservation?
I didn't grow up on it. I lived on one, yeah.
How did that impact your writing style, or just just anything about the way you do the characterizations? Did it have a distinct impact?
Yeah, I mean, it did. It's hard to characterize. I mean, because, this was in the 70s, and I was still living in a place, and they were still very conservative then, Navajos, and they still believed in this sort of pantheistic world in which each rock and tree and so forth has its own spirit. Every place they can point to.
Force?
Not the force, but individual thingies. So I grew up with a little bit of that. I grew up with the Navajo language in my ears, and I could speak some of it on. And it was really later. At the time, I didn't care about archaeology or anthropology. At the time, I was, like most kids, more interested in finding a dinosaur bone. So I was stepping on potsherds and stuff, pushing them aside, looking for dinosaur bones. But it was later, when I got in college, that I started looking back at my experiences and thinking I wanted to know more about them. So I started, majoring in history and then anthropology. My field work as an anthropologist has been with the Choctaw or Mississippi. But I think that, and just also the oral storytelling tradition, I think I get a lot of the way I write and the way I think about writing, I think comes out of those kinds of storytelling.
I was really interested to discover, as I learned more about how the series was made, I know that Jim Lucino said that the Aztec or the Mexica people were a big inspiration for creating the You Should Belong. When you were working that out, was that in your mind of looking to that culture, or were you looking to other native influences?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I was aware of that. The whole sort of blood, the sacrifice, the self-sacrifice, the bloodletting, and all that stuff. And as an anthropologist, what I mostly studied were Native Americans. But at the time, I was actually really, really interested in the Austronesians, the people that peopled Polynesia, parts of New Guinea, Oceania, basically. And so actually, I was, even in sort of some of the naming conventions there, I was drawing on that. Because I felt it was like something that people would not necessarily recognize. And it was what was inspiring me at the moment. So when I was, thinking about especially the Shapers and Mezinkwa, the bad Shaper, that's essentially, forget which culture, but that's a distortion of the name of a monster, a female monster, from one of the oceanic islands. So yeah, I mean, I continued to be informed by the Mesoamerican stuff just because I knew what was going on with them and that, but I was casting a slightly broader net in terms of what my influences were and what I was bringing to it. So people are aware of that stuff. They're usually aware of like the Polynesian elements. Yeah. So people know what a tiki is and who Maui was and things like that, but that's not what I was looking at. I was looking at more the underlying, the people that thousands of years ago, they started out essentially in Taiwan, and they moved out into the ocean. They populated the Philippines. They went as far as Madagascar and the Easter Island. I mean, what they did was actually pretty amazing in terms of covering the world by voyaging, like in these, canoes and kayaks. And outriggers and things like that. And Polynesians are kind of the culmination of it. They're like the acme. They were the best ones, the best navigators, the best sailors. But starting like thousands of years ago, this was already happening. These people were just moving out, populating. So the languages of the Philippines, part of that's inspired by the fact that my brother lived in Malaysia for a while, and we went and stayed with him. So I was in Malaysia. I went to Borneo, which is East Malaysia, and saw some of the indigenous stuff happening there. And it just all seemed really cool to me. So I did it academically. I didn't study that, but in terms of like using it as an inspiration for fiction, I did. So
that is incredible. That's so interesting. Like yourself, I have been very interested in the Polynesians. I was doing some reading about them, and I watched a couple lectures and programs about, just, it does remind me, now that you're saying this, of in these books, the Yuuzhan Vong have this incredible way of sort of intuiting their travel through space. And,
that's in ways,
Right. And the Polynesians, I was so flabbergasted, but in a good way, when I learned, as you, I'm sure, know probably better than me, these charts that they would have with like threads they would read the waves. They could read the waves and read the patterns of clouds in which animals were going to figure out very distant,
like extremely subtle signs,
For the Yuuzhan Vong, like how you picture them. I mean, when they show up on the novel covers, is that what you picture, or do you picture a different looking?
I guess I was influenced by how they showed up on the covers and how they were described in earlier books. But Teresa Nielsen did the cover of Conquest, and I actually have worked with her on covers from some of my own books as well. She did a lot of Magic the Gathering cards. That's kind of what she was famous for. But she also, and then Yim actually, because I think I've talked to her about it, is pretty freaking close to what I was picturing. The image of her.
Is she is she the one who's featured on the covers of Conquest and Final Prophecy, or
I would have to look at it, but she's definitely on one of them, because she's got the little saw finger.
Because I was wondering if that was Mezon Quad on Conquest, or actually
no, I think it's Nen Yim.
This would be Nen Yim.
Yeah, that's Nen Yim.
Perfect.
Pong, Nen Yim, and Anakin. Yeah,
I love Wu's design. That's so freaky. It's amazing.
Yeah. So I think again, I was working with what was already there, and
the Medusa hair.
That's I wanted the Shapers to have a different thing going on, but they're still, they're modified.
That's really cool that she talked with you and that you guys worked on that.
Yeah, it's not often that you get to talk with the cover artist, so it was kind of cool.
Some people do the action figures, I do the books, and I'm like on a quest to get every Star Wars book signed eventually. Alan Dean Foster, he was a hard one, but I got him.
Yeah, he doesn't get out that much anymore. Nope. First, he's a funny guy. The first time I ever met him, he walks up, he's like, "What do I call you, Jay?"
Oh, God.
The time was Jay Gregory.
Nice.
And he was pretty gruff with me until he had just come back from
one of the many places he
Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, I had just come back from Malaysia. And then he started to relax, because one of his big beefs with fantasy and science fiction authors is they don't actually ever do anything real. They don't actually ever go someplace and climb a mountain.
So you're a fencer?
I am, yeah. I've been fencing since like the late 90s, I guess. When I was living in Seattle, I started fencing there as research for a book. But then I really got into it and ended up not only competing, but coaching.
It shows too in your work that you can tell with certain authors when they write scenes that are some sort of battle. Like you can tell they have a mindset of how the movements are performed, and it really stands out.
I took Shotokan as a teenager. I did that for a few years. I competed in that too prior to my fencing experience. I think looking back on it, one of the reasons I took Shotokan was to try to control my temper, control this tendency I had to get into fights. Part of that Shotokan thing was I wanted some discipline. I felt like I needed some discipline.
Yeah. And that's a good thing you can get from that, is how to control yourself. It's more a mental thing too. It's not just learning how to fight, how to control that inner energy, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. And fencing, it's not exactly that, but it's similar. Fencing is a solitary sport. It's just you and the other person. It's really all about you. Whether you're in control of yourself or not.
I know there's 3 different styles, 3 different disciplines to it.
There's foil, and there's epee, and then there's saber, which is the one weapon of the 3 that has a theoretical edge. Saber is the one, though, that I think that if I had a lightsaber, I would fence it the way people fence saber. Because if you're talking about sort of a more or less weightless blade, that's what modern saber is. It's a really, really light weapon. It's got a theoretical edge, so you can cut with it as well as poke. And some of that did carry over to Conquest. And in fact, there's a move that I not invented. There's a move in foil fencing called the flick, which was invented by the Russian team decades ago now, but it was still relatively new when I was fencing. And the flick recognizes that the foil is really, really bendy. So you can kind of go like this and make the weapon's tip bend all the way around and hit somebody in the back. And so I thought, when I was writing Conquest, I thought, well, you could totally do that with an amphistaff, right? Because they can be rigid, they can be, fluid, they can be anything in between. So I had some of the people with amphistaffs doing flicks.
Yeah. I noticed that.
I wanted to ask you quick about the Peace Brigade. You got to write a lot about the Peace Brigade. What was it like writing, what was your thought process when you're writing these kind of, I know it's happened in history, but
the collaborationists, they're apologists, they're collaborationists. It's happened a lot in history, and mostly we don't remember those people well. Right? They mostly, when we look back at groups like that, it's not kindly.
No.
But I think they're also sort of inevitable. Like in any big conflict, there's going to be some group of people that think that the best way to muddle through this is to collaborate, right? So, it's easy, and it's really easy to find examples, Vichy in France. And so that actually wasn't hard at all. There's just so many examples of that already out there. And it's not that difficult to sort of put one together. And of course, I'm pretty sure I didn't come up with the Peace Brigade. I think it already existed. But
that did cross my mind, Vichy Shesh and Vichy France.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's really an obvious example, but there are plenty of others. We had American people collaborating with the Nazis in the 30s. There wasn't that element here.
With that, I don't know if Vichy Shesh was inspired by Vichy France, but was there ever a moment writing these books where you threw in a detail or a name that you didn't think anyone would catch, but you had fun?
Yeah, other than the references to like Melanesian mythology, I have a tendency, if I can, to slip in names of my friends in some form.
Yeah.
Or people I know. And I will often make very oblique references to historical figures as well, but nothing jumps out at me from those books other than the names of some of the Vong. And of course, I got to kill Ykrit, which a lot of people liked. Well, I can remember when I was going to include Ykrit, and I said something about I feel like he's going to get killed. And somebody at the ranch, I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, yes, probably death is best for Ykrit.
So going into Rebirth,
Mhm.
these are basically a duo set of books. Was that like the plan? Was this going to be a one book situation, or did they want two?
It was the plan. They wanted two. In fact, they're both packaged together as Edge of Victory, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Right. So it was, I think, meant to be sort of a hinge point in that story arc where we start to see them winning a little bit. Right. We start up until now, up until that point, there's been a lot of losing going on. Chewie gets killed, and Edge of Victory was supposed to be the point where we start seeing them win a little bit. And another reason it was fun to write that. And of course, in Rebirth, there's also a literal birth, which is Luke and Mara Jade's kid.
What was it like writing Luke and Mara? These are huge characters.
Yeah, that made me a little nervous because Mara is also this fan favorite character that you just can't get wrong. But with Luke, of course, you have representations of him in the movies that everybody's sort of working from, and then you got the stuff in the books that elaborate on that. Mara's completely, generated by the expanded universe. So you make understanding what the fans like about her and what they want to see from her was something I had to think about a lot because I didn't know that much about her. Right. I did go back and read some of those books to get a handle on it. So it was that, other than to say that I was kind of nervous about it and I spent a lot of time thinking about it, I was fairly careful about how I did it.
Yeah, that I can only imagine. I mean, that's an incredible thing, not just to write them, but to write, the birth of sort of the next generation, and really simultaneously with that, Mara's being cured of her illness.
Right.
Which is kind of a beautiful, almost symbolism there of the end of one thing and the start of another thing.
Well, I will say that writing Luke's son being born, that was crazy. I knew that was going to happen. And I asked them, well, what's the kid's name going to be? I mean, they said, well, you can go ahead and name him. And they didn't really mean that. What they meant was I could present them with a bunch of possible names. And then they would choose. And Ben was not my first choice at all. Actually, originally, my idea was that he would name him after his uncle that raised him, because he's hoping not that his son will be a warrior or a Jedi or involved in warfare, but that he will be somebody that just lives a normal, peaceful, ordinary life, right?
Right.
And they're like, well, okay, you can pick, but maybe from this list. So they gave me a list of possible names. Ben was such a natural choice. And they made the same choice, of course, in the sequels with different parents, but they made the same choice because it seems sort of obvious after that book came out. One of the funny fallouts from that, from my point of view, was at that point in time, I used to go to Dragon Con every year. And I actually started going to Dragon Con again in the past few years because my brother goes, my kids love to cosplay. If you've never been to Dragon Con, it's like the biggest cosplay event you'll ever see. It's just fantastic. And back then I would go as an author, and I was walking around the dealer's room, and this group of young women found me, and they were the Schwicks, the Star Wars chicks. And they had just read Rebirth, and they had had a baby shower for Ben, and they had all these presents to give me from the baby shower.
Really?
Yeah. And I was kind of walking around with a couple of friends of mine who were just there out of curiosity. They weren't really huge fans of the whole thing. I mean, they were of course aware of Star Wars, but they weren't like they just like at the time they were really confused as to what was going on. They're like, what's happening here? You know, like what's happening? Yeah. I knew what was happening, but I still was not something I was expecting, and it was fun. You know, it was cool. I can't even tell you now because that was a long time ago what exactly they gave me, but I remember I had an armload of stuff.
That's cool. That's a wild story, but that's cool. You know, and that's what I mean. These books, they really affect people, right? Like,
yeah.
When you were dealing with Talon Card, did you call up Tim Zahn and go, "Hey"?
I didn't call him.
Can I do this?
Because I don't really know him, but I know Mike Stackpole real well. So anytime I had to write about Corrin, I call him and we talked. And I read the Zahn books to have some idea what I was about.
Corrin Horn, who is also rapidly approaching big cult status too.
Yeah.
Just imagine trying to kill him off also. If you wanted to kill Talon Card, would you have been allowed to?
I couldn't kill Talon without getting permission.
Permission from the author who created them, or from
Lucasfilm. We don't know these things. We have
So who are you allowed to kill? Somebody you create in your book, and you can kill them by the end of your
Well,
book?
in the Edge of Victory, a lot of Jedi die, and they gave me a list of expendable Jedi.
There's a lot.
Yeah, well, because
so many of them somehow managed to survive.
Yeah.
Could you, if you get to write another Star Wars book, could you do me a huge favor? Just one request I've never asked of an author, but I think I'm going to ask all of them this. Could you just find a way or get permission to kill off Kip Duran? I would be forever grateful. Oh, God.
Most people aren't.
He's one of the worst characters.
You almost need him there, though.
He's like, I blew up an entire planet and killed everyone, but I'm okay. I said sorry.
Yeah,
and what the heck?
And again, he was somebody that I was sort of tasked to write about. That was not a choice I made. And I went back and read his backstory, and I had the same reaction. I was like, what?
Yeah, it's okay.
Oh, he's a Jedi, so we're gonna let you take care of it, Luke. And Luke's like, all right, don't do it again. I'm like, what?
I'd be like, all right, dude, you're one with the Force now. Put him in prison, something,
But
Holy cow.
But I get to get a little creepy with him and Jano, and that was kind of
that was disgusting. Do you know what you have created? There is a whole cult following of Kip Jaina shippers out there who want nothing more than this great, awesome character Jaina to hook up with this creepy old man who's her father's friend.
Well,
her father's friend.
To be fair, he's my age, and I was dating somebody about her age when I read that.
But what I'm saying is he's her father. Hey, my husband's 32, I'm 25. There's age difference between us. I'm just saying that was pretty freaky. I mean, it was great, but I'm really glad that it got backed off and she started dating Jagged Fell.
We never intended for that to really go anywhere.
But there's a lot of people out there who are like, woo,
But I didn't like Kip already, and I thought that this would only add to his mystique of
disgustingness.
Yeah.
I guess the question that I'd be killed if I didn't ask from some of the listeners would be on the differences between the Star Wars and the Babylon 5 books in terms of how much you were given to start with. The B5 books, Psy-Core trilogy says right there at the top, based on an outline by J. Michael Straczynski, and then we all know that there are certain things in the New Jedi Order that were required in terms of each story.
The Bible.
How did it differ in terms of what you were given and how much leeway you got on each of those?
When I was working with Babylon 5, I actually was working from outlines written by Straczynski. But within those, these outlines were like a paragraph long. And within those outlines, I was given a great deal of latitude. And anytime I had a question about it, I just called, right? How many countries, which countries are in the Earth Alliance? Well, these we know, and then just make up the rest. That was, Star Wars was a little, there are more rules in place. There's sort of a Bible in place. And there are a lot of conference calls where I was talking to other writers, to editors, to people from Lucasfilms. So there was a lot of sort of socialization, I guess, in the writing of those books. And then just since then, Steve Saffel's been the editor on quite a few of the licensed things I've done, including the novelization of Interstellar and the more recent, the recent Planet of the Apes novels.
Was George involved in this process?
Not very. That's why, there was Sue Rostani, whose job was to be the liaison. She worked at the ranch, right? She was part of that whole thing. But her job was licensing literature, the books, and other media representations that weren't movies. And so Lucas, as far as I know, was fairly separated from this. I mean, he obviously got final word. I'll give you an example of something I know that happened. And that was when Chewie got killed, it wasn't at all clear it was Chewie that was going to get killed. They were supposed to kill somebody, like one of the original 7, right?
Yeah.
And eventually the choices came down to Chewie and R2 for the same reasons, because it's hard to write them. Like in the movies, they make noises and people interpret.
Yep.
But it's difficult to do that in the books, right? And then the third possibility was Londo, because he is a lot like Han and was seen as being like, do we really need 2 of these guys, right? Yeah. It ended up being Chewie, which was bad. You know, Bob Salvatore got death threats. Some of the crazier fans, and it was not his choice. But, you know, briefly, I guess they considered even killing Luke. And at the time, Lucas was like, no, you're not going to do that. And that's the first time I'd actually made the connection that Lucas and Luke are the same name. But they are.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, if he was involved in the decision, I think it was at that level. Right.
Yeah.
It wasn't at the level of down here. But that's not to say that these books weren't thoroughly vetted by Lucasfilms, because they were, just not by him. So aside from Sue, they actually had, I'm going to call them a room full of Star Wars fans. They weren't literally all in the same room, but it was about 24 people who were really, really, really fans of the movies, of the expanded universe. They'd read everything. They were really into it. There were all kinds of people involved. I mean, I remember meeting one of them was assistant DA in Los Angeles County, but then others were like high school students. You know, I mean, it was just a wide range of people that had somehow gotten onto Lucasfilm's radar as these super fans who really knew what they were talking about. And they read draft versions of all of those books. And if they said, this book is not a Star Wars book, I mean, sometimes it was just like, okay, well, we feel like Mara Jade is being portrayed wrong here, so maybe the author could fix that. But in a couple of cases, they said, I don't know what's going on with this book, but it's not a Star Wars book. And those books did not get published. There were a couple that did not get published because these guys read them and said, no, this is not.
Doesn't feel like it?
It doesn't feel like it. Han's not Han. Luke's not Luke. You know, and more importantly, maybe Mara Jade's not Mara. You know, again, the ones that are not the film characters, people had very strong feelings about some of those characters, right?
Oh yeah.
They had grown up with them. They had come to love them in their own right. There was a sense of proprietorship there because the general Star Wars audience wasn't even aware they existed. Like the people that so casually watch the movies, they don't know who Talon Card is or Corran Horn or even Mara Jade, right?
Yeah.
They have no idea who those people are. But the fans of the expanded universe really knew who they were, right? And had very strong ideas about who they were based on who had created them and how they were written by those authors. And so picking up another author's character and treating them appropriately is actually more difficult than treating like Han Solo appropriately, because all you have to do is just watch the movies over and over again and pick up on his patterns and his you know, all that. But nevertheless, some people tended to get even those characters wrong.
Working on a licensed work as opposed to working on my own stuff, the big difference for me is who is looking over my shoulder. So I wrote The Age of Unreason, which is set in the 18th century, and it's got historical characters in it like Ben Franklin and Louis XIV. And so I have, when I'm writing that, these imaginary historians looking critically, very critically over my shoulder at what I'm writing. And very likely none of those famous historians ever read that, but that was who I was imagining, right? So I felt beholden to that. I still want to get right what should be right. And when I'm working on Star Wars, let's say, well, what's looking over my shoulder there is this sea of fans who are going to know if I get the lightsaber the wrong color, or if Mara Jade acts the wrong way, and so forth. And it's actually a little more intimidating than the historians.
I can see that.
But there's also a certain amount of feedback. Like when I was working on those books, they actually had kind of a stable of people who read that were not professional editors. They were just mega fans who all read the manuscripts, at least in the New Jedi Order, and would weigh in on it. They would say, this is a Star Wars book, or it's not a Star Wars book, or Han would not ever say that, or, and they canceled some books. I mean, they carry enough weight that books that the publishers did not publish because these guys said, this isn't Star Wars. It doesn't read right.
Yeah, how intimidating
That's intimidating, but
yeah.
I had relatively little trouble with it. I enjoyed it. It was, it was pretty fun. I kind of liken it to writing a haiku, right? Writing a haiku is confining, it's constraining, but in its own way, though, it forces you to think about how to say something concisely, right?
There are limitations. There are things you can and can't do. And that was true in Star Wars. Things that you absolutely were forbidden from doing.
Right.
And sometimes there are weird things. Like you were allowed to say, look over there, said Luke, but you couldn't say, look over there, Luke said. Or I can't remember which. One of those orders was
one of
not
those.
yeah. And then also we were not supposed to ever mention at that time a soul. Like Star Wars people don't have souls per se, right? Or they didn't at that point. We were told that a new invention's never going to solve the problem. It's always going to come from people. Like it's going to always come from heroic impulses from people rising up to the challenge. It's never going to be because you invent this new widget that destroys the enemy.
Yeah.
Because that's not what Star Wars is about. It's about spirit triumphing over whatever. But I always have said that writing license work is like writing a haiku, right? With a haiku, you know how many syllables are allowed and what order they have to be in. And in some ways that can be very grounding and can help you write something really good. Having structure is not bad. Having structure imposed on you is not bad. It makes you think about how I'm going to do something inside of this structure. I knew that those guys knew more about the Star Wars universe, right? They were also a sample of the audience that I was writing for, which is important. You have to know who your readers are and what they want.
Yeah.
You definitely got to be in touch with that, especially when you're doing a popular license thing like Star Wars. I mean,
as far as I can tell from the Amazon reviews, whatever those mean, most people thought I did a fine job on the books. A small minority of them thought my books.
What books are you referencing?
The Star Wars books. I'm sorry. Okay. A small minority thought that they were the best Star Wars books ever, and a small minority, and by minority I mean 10 people.
I thought they were great.
Thought that they were the worst ones ever written. And one of these guys that thought it was The Conquest was the worst one ever written said, Greg Keyes should never be allowed to write another Star Wars book. He shouldn't have written this one. He shouldn't be allowed to write another one. I know he's writing one more, and I will buy it. Because it is a Star Wars book,
What? Did you come up with a super weapon of the week in any of your books?
No, I had a
No,
fake
so
super
you're
weapon.
not the worst Star Wars author ever, okay?
But there's a fake super weapon.
I know, and you know what? It was a great plot device, because when I was reading the book, I went, oh gosh,
Not a
she came up
super
with
weapon.
another super weapon. Just, why do these authors do it? And then you read it, and you're like, ooh, good twist.
Yeah. Always any book I write, no matter what it is, no matter whether it's one of my original works or Star Wars or whatever, I really want to do the best job that can be done in the time given. Right? I don't want to write a bad book. That doesn't mean I haven't, but I don't want to. And I always want to do my source material justice if I can. And the more excited I can get about it, the easier that is. And it was really easy to get excited about those books.
Appreciate all the magic that you've created for us. So,
Thanks.
Mr. Greg Keyes, thank you again so much for hanging out with me and talking and sharing your stories. Yeah.
Fun.
Now, some of you out there listening may be wondering, I've heard that name, Shannon McRandall. And Shannon is actually the real-life model and the hand-picked by Lucasfilm physical representation of Mrs. Luke Skywalker, Mara Jade. So it's very cool to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
What are some Mara-inspired, or I should say Shannon-inspired Mara products that people can see?
Well, my two favorite things, just because of the artwork, I think are amazing. The Star Wars Union comic book, it's Luke and Mara getting married. So I love that one. And then the cover of Rebirth, when they had her on the front with Luke and she's pregnant. Mm-hmm. That's just beautiful. You can't see the whole piece of art on the novel, but I saw the art. It was on auction at one of the conventions, and someone I knew bought it, and so I got to see the whole thing, and she's pregnant, and it's just gorgeous. I mean, what a pretty picture of me, not just Mara, but it's just so wonderful.
Well, see, there you go. Now you could have used that time when you were pregnant for the...
I know. They didn't think of that. I know. I told them they should have gotten a couple shots of me pregnant to hold on to in case it ever came up again. I didn't know about the cover of Rebirth until my daughter and I were Christmas shopping, and I saw it at Walden Books. 1,000 of them in the storefront. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's me.
It's really funny. I remember reading an interview with Hayden Christensen after episode 3 came out. Mm-hmm. And he said the weirdest thing was just, going back home to his hometown up in Canada and going to the grocery store with his mom, and his face is everywhere on a bag of chips, on a,
Oh, yeah.
And is that is strange then? I guess it would be.
Yeah, it is. And, of course, those people, it's on such a huge level, all the things that come out. I can't imagine what that must be like, but they really don't say anything to me unless they actually need me for something. You'll get an email or a phone call, and by the way, your figure's coming out next week, and we'd like you to sign it.
I think the joke was Carrie Fisher once said that every time she looks in the mirror, she owes George Lucas $5.
I wish that were true for me. I would so love to be able to say that, but I just got paid a regional modeling rate for the hours that I put in. There was no huge sum of money ever, believe me.
So, as going to these conventions, it's not just fans that you get to meet. You actually get to meet some of the stars of Star Wars also.
Yeah, I probably met most everyone who does the conventions.
Well, and that's great. And you actually you have a photo of yourself with Mark Hamill.
Yes, we were at the same convention in New Jersey, one of the first ones that he said, "Okay, I'll do a Star Wars thing." I hadn't met him backstage, behind the scenes. We just had different schedules, and I'm like, gosh, I will die if I'm at this thing and I don't get to meet him. This is just not fair. So they took me into his talk. I think it was on Saturday. He had this, big talk that he was giving to everybody in the auditorium. And they sat me up front, and eventually someone asked, well, what do you think about your Star Wars wife? And he said, well, I've seen a picture of her, and she's really hot. But no, I don't know her. And everyone in the audience knew I was sitting there and just burst into laughter. And I mean, oh my goodness. And of course, then they said, well, have her up, get her up there. She's right there. So I went up on stage and, shook hands and gave him a hug, and people took pictures, and it was just to catch him off guard like that was funny, but, kind of not nice. But we just knew, everyone knew.
Well, I could think of worse things than standing on a stage and hugging you and getting my picture taken.
No, I know, but his wife was sitting right behind me, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't look good.
Yeah, but you know what? In my mind, in Pete's mind, and everyone else, you're his wife.
Yeah, they wanted that picture, that never before, maybe never again.
Absolutely.
Real life photograph.
Absolutely, and that's very cool. That's very cool.
it was wonderful that they got me in and had me meet him like that. But he was also really a charming person. You know, I didn't know what to expect because, like I said, he hadn't done anything Star Wars in so long. He was just so charming, and his talk was wonderful. You know, I can't think of one bad thing to say about him.
You said earlier that the fans have treated you really well. Do you have a one that kind of sticks out in mind as like your best experience with a fan?
There's one thing that made me really understand, I guess, that what I'm doing and what people in my position do affects people more than we ever really know. And that was when I was doing a convention in Texas. The first one I did was in Plano. And the San Antonio fan club came out to see me, say hi, and welcome me. You know, to see the other people there too, but they really made an effort to come as a group, as a complete group, and say hi to me and make me feel good about being in Texas for the first time. And I mean, it was just great. Took pictures, you know, talked to me forever. I signed autographs. I tried to chit chat with everybody. And there were a few younger people there that I really tried to spend time with, because I always think, well, what if my daughter were a big fan and met the person that she really loved? You know, this is what I would want them to do for her. So I talk like that. Well, they came out to see me when I did the next Texas convention in Austin just a few months later. And promoter of the convention pulled me aside and said, you know, the Centennial Fan Club is here again, and they came to see you, and they would like to know if they could have a few minutes of your time, you know, away from the dining area. They'd like to share something with you that's happened since the last time they saw you. There was a little girl that belonged to that fan club, and favorite character was Mara Jade. She just really identified, I guess, and idolized the character from the books and the comics. It was just somebody she could look up to, and I think try to relate a little bit. And you know, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to put it. I've never been one of those people who idolize somebody. But for a 12-year-old, I guess that can be kind of a big deal. And it was Mara Jade for her. So meeting me was a huge thing in her life. She got pneumonia and died before the next convention. And her last words to the fan club and to her brother and sister, who I guess a big presence in the fan club, last words to them were, you know, thank you so much. That just really meant the world to me, and she was so nice, and I am so appreciative. So right up until the end, my portrayal of that character to this little girl, I mean, it kept her going. It helped her. It made her last few minutes really special to her. And when they told me that, I sat down and cried. I just, I don't think about things like that. I don't think anybody really does. And then when you hear something like that you're just a nice person in somebody's life like that, it makes everything that you've done in the job worthwhile. And I will never forget that as long as I live. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons that I try to be nice and listen to the fans and do what I think they would want done, and, to be a good person about it because of that little girl.
Yeah. Wow.
Mara Jade's really kind of an unusual character in how well known she is. I mean, she's one of those Star Wars Expanded Universe characters that has this enormous fan following. She was, she's the only Expanded Universe character in the 1997 poll of the top 20. She was the first EU character given an action figure, and she gets chosen repeatedly for different things for the games and such.
I think the Mara that we love is, kind of a bad button. Kicks her way through stuff and doesn't take any crap from anybody. I think that her life took her to a certain place, and rather than sitting back and taking it, she put one foot in front of the other and fought her way through it. So I think she was a phenomenal character in that sense, and I think everybody loves her because of that. She was a little bit wicked, she had her dark moments, and we all knew why because we followed her story, but, in the end, the real person, the real Mara came out. So
you mentioned her having the different life experiences and such. Of course, she goes from being a dark character to becoming sort of a heroic character, eventually having a child and such.
Maybe the having the baby and getting married stuff. Everybody wants to find true love. Everybody, if they find the true love, I think that that's a natural progression of life, is to settle down no matter what you do or who you are, and hopefully have children and, make your place and move on in life. So I think everything that happened to her was natural in that respect. That kind of kept towards, she was a good person. Inside, ultimately, she's a good person. So I think that was a totally natural progression, and I'm happy with all of that.
I'm here with Mark Hamill. He plays Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. So, are you amazed at the impact it's made after 20 years?
Of course. I've done a lot of other things since, but, the passion that people have for these movies, they've kept them alive in their hearts and their minds for so long, and it's like I call myself the host body because I did 3 movies and I played Luke, but Luke's gone on to have adventures in comic books and adventures in CD-ROMs and games and novels and so forth. I sort of kind of left it behind, and his life and his adventures have gone on. And so my kids are more expert at all the minutia of the stories than I am.
There are people there that have like a encyclopedic knowledge of all Star Wars minutiae, everything in the extended universe and the comic books and the games and all of it. And a lot of my favorite plots had already been done.
I used to say to George, it was funny, why can't Luke have a girlfriend? Eventually I heard in the extended universe there's Mara Jade, and he got married, he had kids. I still don't know. Are Jedi supposed to be celibate? Or can they be married with children?
One thing bugging both Daniels and Hamill is that so far, neither of their characters gets a girl. I guess every actor wants to be Clark Gable.
I'm Ralph Bellamy. Yeah. Why should she wind up with me? That's too perfect and too boring. On the other hand, I thought that there was room for some sexy siren from the blue moon of wherever.
To come in and take Harrison away?
No, to come in and satisfy my needs.
And hang on for this exclusive. Producer George Lucas has told Hamill to, get ready for another role in the year 2000.
George has talked to me marginally about doing something at the turn of the century in the last trilogy, but it wouldn't be on the same plane of existence, if you know what I mean.
What it sounds like is that he offered you a job to play a father and Luke Jr. around the year 2000.
You're a very clever man, Mr. Siskel.
Well, my son reads all the Star Wars novels and so forth, and he goes, hey, Dad, did you know Luke Skywalker's married with children? And look, your wife's a smoking hot redhead. I said, leave it to them to get me a girlfriend 9 years after I left the series. Her name's Mara Jade, so come on over, Mara.
You did some short story work too. Emissary of the Void. I believe they were in like the game magazines or something.
Yeah, Star Wars Gamer, I think is where it started. They actually ended up being in a couple of different magazines. So, yeah, when I was living in Seattle, I got to know some of the people at Wizards of the Coast, and a guy named Dave Gross, who was an editor. He worked for Wizards of the Coast at the time. But there was a whole community there. There was a huge science fiction fantasy community there. But anyway, yeah, I was tapped to do some short stories that would be related to the New Jedi Order. That would take place during the New Jedi Order, but would not feature really any of the major characters. And as I said earlier, I had been reading some of those young adult and kids books, and there was a character named Oldir. He was featured in some of those books, who desperately wanted to be a Jedi, but he just didn't have the aptitude for it. And he was kind of a screw-up character. He, created problems that had to be solved by the young Jedi. He wasn't a bad guy. His heart was in the right place, sort of. And in the end, he decided that he could help. He wanted to help people, so he would be a rescue pilot, right? So I thought, well, why don't I age Aldir up? and make him a rescue pilot. And he making him a rescue pilot during the period of the Yuuzhan Vong purge of the Jedi, like the second big Jedi purge, right?
In even Emissary of the Void for Insider and Gamer, it's Uldir.
Yeah, I loved writing those
Uldir.
stories.
Who the heck is Uldir from Anakin's Quest?
Yep.
What?
I knew who you were talking about, though, because I haven't read them. I had to have read the 6 Junior Jedi Knight books, which, okay, they go to some weird Vader's fortress something and fight a magician. They're just absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
The way I got to Uldir, actually, is, so there's this purge, of Jedi, and basically they're hunting down anybody they even think might be a Jedi. And remember, he did go to the academy. He turned out to be a bust because he didn't have midichlorians or something. But it just kind of occurred to me, well, this guy, he went off to be a rescue pilot. And I wanted to write, Dave Gross asked me to write those stories, and he wanted them. He said, you can do anything you want, basically. So we have to get it approved. He said, but just throw me any idea you want. And I said, well, why don't I just take some characters that aren't in any way main characters, that nobody's ever heard of, and make most of them up, and just have them adventuring sort of in the cracks of all this big stuff going on, right? They're doing the little things. He's a rescue pilot, And those were actually a great deal of fun. I really enjoyed writing those. I just picked Uldir from Perversity, I think, because he was a horrible character in the book, in the Junior Jedi book. But I figured, well, I enjoyed sort of growing up Tahiri, so maybe I can.
One thing that I noticed, not really, I guess, a theme, but just things that are in common between the B5 and the Star Wars books that you had written. In Star Wars, you've got your fanatics, you've got your Yuuzhan Vong, very fanatical individuals, and you also have, in B5, you got the early Psi-Corps or anti-metasensory regulation terrorists.
Right.
When you're writing stuff like that, do you look at world events that are going on, or you try to take it straight from that universe and not allow the real world to kind of intrude on what you're writing? Even in Emissary of the Void, there was an element of terrorism to that, wasn't there? Because the poisoning of a Bacta supply was part of the backdrop of that.
Yeah, there was, and that was post 9/11. I don't think I was really thinking of any connection there.
Chemical warfare, biological warfare.
But see, I've been thinking about those things for a long time. Of course, I wrote about terrorists a lot in the B5 books, but that was, of course, before 9/11.
Right.
And it's not that there wasn't terrorism before that. There was actually plenty. And I did, of course, look at the way terrorists did things to sort of get an idea of how to my terrorists act.
I got to invent a Jedi, Klin Fagi, and she was a lot of fun to write. Uldir was a lot of fun to write. He had this motley crew of his, and of course he was a rescue pilot, but he was also working against the Vong, right? So his job had taken on a new dimension now that the Vong were there. Before he was just like, if a ship was stranded or out of oxygen or whatever, he would deal with that. So they were a lot of fun, and they were written as serial. So a new installment came out every month, which was also kind of cool. I'd never done that before.
Yeah.
And that's something that harkens directly back to the beginnings of science fiction and fantasy. A lot of what we think of started as serials and magazines. I still hear about those. People are still finding those to read. I think mostly online at this point. I've got the magazines, I guess. But it's it's stuff that's happening in the cracks of what the big events. These are smaller events, right? But they're nevertheless important. And you can see some things about what's going on. So
because you're right. I mean, they're important to if you want a fuller experience of what's going on. And like you said, you got to create, and that was probably really fun too, because you got to play in a realm where you could add to it on your own.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't violate any of the Star Wars conventions. Well, right. I couldn't alter the greater story arc, right? I couldn't do anything that would have to be referred to in the other books. But it was just its own little story set in the backdrop of the bigger one, and I quite enjoyed it.